Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining today's conference, Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Before we begin, please ensure that you have the chat panel open to reach out to the event producer with any problems. There will not be any questions taken through chat. All audio lines have been muted until the Q&A portion of the call. We will give you instructions on how to ask a question verbally at that time. With that, I turn over the call to Dr. Ben Hobbs, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee. Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much, Yolande. And good morning, everybody. We have a somewhat short but very packed meeting, packed in that there's a lot of content on a lot of topics that I think you'll find very interesting, a lot of new ideas and data. So you better buckle your seatbelts. Here we go. So before starting the agenda, let me introduce the people who are around the virtual table. And from the Market Surveillance Committee, there's myself, Ben Hobbs, the chair. And then there are members, Dr. Scott Harvey and Dr. Jim Bushnell. And then from the ISO staff, we have Dr. Guillermo Bautista Alderete, who will be giving the first presentation, and along with Abhishek Hundawala. Then the second presentation will be given by Amber Motley, who's in charge of forecasting, and her colleagues who are also with us, Laisha Matsunobu and Tobias Steckel. And Tobias will be also making the fourth presentation in the meeting this morning. In addition, we have Amelia Blank from the ISO staff and Shami Davis. Anybody else from the ISO with us? I don't think so.
That's correct. You got it.
Okay. So the order of business is, as usual, we'll start with public comment, and I'll ask whether there's anybody listening in who would like to make a general comment, specific comment, ask a question. If it's about the topics on the agenda today, I'd prefer that you wait until an appropriate time to do that. But if it's on anything else concerning the California markets, I would welcome a comment or question at this time. So, Yolanda, can you see if anybody would like to queue up?
If you would like to ask a question, if you're on the phone line, press star pound. If you are on the WebEx, please press the raised hand icon and you will be unmuted. We have one question from Harsh P.
From Harsh, okay. That's great. Welcome.
This is Hirsch. I'm with QCells. The question.
You're a little faint. If you could just speak up a bit.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
It's better.
Okay. I'll try my best. I think I'm just having some audio issues, and then otherwise I might have to just chat it out. But I'll try here. This is Hirsch. I'm with QCells. The question I have this morning is, I'm looking to see if CAISO would be willing to provide the historical information they use to come up with attenuation factors that battery operators are requested to use within their, operations. It's something that I've been trying to ask for information-wise with particular people in CAISO, and I haven't gotten a response yet. And I wanted to kind of bring it up here generally.
Okay, so if I understand, you're talking about the attenuation factors used to represent the changes in state of charge as a result of providing regulation or perhaps other ancillary services?
Particularly just for regulation up and down, as I understand that's what they're used for.
Okay. Up and down. That's great. Let me just check to see if there's anybody from ISO staff online now who would like to address the availability of the information used to calculate those.
See two hands up, Ben.
I see Amelia. Thank you. And hold on just a second. Amelia, go ahead.
Sure.
I would just suggest if you do have data requests such as this one, that you make them through the regular appropriate channels. There are ways for market participants to request data, and there are ways for non-market participants but other interested stakeholders to make these data requests, and we're happy to take them through the regular channels. They don't need to go through the MSC. If you do have a question, feel free to, and need more information about how to make those data requests, feel free to reach out to me personally, and it's just the first initial last name, so ABLANKE @kaiso.com. Pass it off to Guillermo.
I should clarify, I have tried to go through the regular channels to do this. The answer I'm getting is no, we won't provide it, but as battery operators, it is important to have this information. We're going to be deploying about 1 gig of batteries within the next 2 years. And I think just having this information that's almost public, it seems, is just, I'm not sure why CAISO is not able to provide it. And it was used to come up with these attenuation factors. So I'm just trying to figure out what's another channel that kind of requests this that I think battery operators find important, I would think.
Amelia or Guillermo, would you like to address that? About the whether there's a policy about the data?
Yes, let me generally respond to this. I would be happy to follow up to see what the request has been made, and we are not aware of such, but I will be happy to follow up with that offline. Regarding the request per se, I can tell you a couple of things. The first one is that there is indeed material already posted on the website, in addition to the attenuation factor that we provide on a monthly basis. You also have a series of materials that we have posted about the performance of the attenuation factors. You can check, for instance, the most recent Market Performance Forum meeting. We have highlighted the values of the regulation up, the regulation down, and I would like to better understand the level of detail that you may be looking for, because at the end of the day, the underlying data is resource specific, and that is the level of data that we cannot provide because it's market sensitive. But in any other type of aggregation, we would be open to discuss what possibilities we have.
Yeah, should I reach out to you, Guillermo? Maybe in greater detail. I don't want to take up any more time in this meeting then.
Yes, please. I'm happy to help here.
Okay. All right. Amelia, I might just reach out to you to get Guillermo's email address, and then we can take it from there.
Okay. Thanks for the question. Thanks.
Thank you.
And thanks, Guillermo, Amelia, for responding. Yolanda, do we have anybody else on the phone line?
No, both lines are empty.
Okay, that's great. So we're ready to go. So Guillermo, I hope you haven't gone too far, because you'll be on first. And so Guillermo has a presentation that he's put together with Abhishek Khandwala on RUC adjustments and their market implications. There's a lot of terrific data in here and insights about how RUC has performed over the last few years. So looking forward to that. Guillermo, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ben, for the introduction, and good morning, members of the Market Surveillance Committee. If we can move to the presentation, please. As a background, we have part of our day-ahead process, including the pass of what we call the Reliability Unit Commitment. That is the RUC process. This is a process that is designed to ensure that based on the integrated forward market, which is the financial solution, we have positioned resources properly to be able to meet our day-ahead forecast for the CAISO system. When we start performing the assessment of the RUC, over the years, there has been a component that is operator action, what we call the RUC adjustment, the RUC conformance, and it's no more than an adjustment to the load forecast that is utilized as part of the RUC process to clear resources and ensure we have enough committed capacity to meet not only the day-ahead forecast, but also the factors that the operators may be seeing in addition to the level of the load forecast. That is the topic of this presentation. And we have discussed in at least a couple of previous market performance forums the trends, the performance of the ROC adjustments. And this is a follow-up to that discussion, given some very interesting trends that we start to see past summer 2023. With that, please, let's move to the first slide. And history is relevant here. What we have is this ROC adjustment that is a factor that we put on top, and actually could be positive or negative. Most of the time it's a positive value, meaning we're increasing the load forecast that is used as the target for the day-ahead process. What we have here is a trend over the years, going from 2017 up to last month, March 2024. It is a distribution trend that shows you in the box the 75% of the distribution of the ROC adjustments on an hourly basis, and there is one distribution per month. There are some dots that are the outliers outside the distribution that is a very well typical definition of the box whisker plot. And this gives you a sense first of two dimensions to the trend. The first one is how frequently, how much it has been used over the years, and second, the magnitude of this ROC adjustment. You can see that as early as March or January 2017, there was very few instances in which we utilized the ROC adjustments. As we progress over the years, that utilization has increased, not only in the frequency, but also in the magnitude. The highest values that we observed happened to be during the summer 2022, when we reached basically 10,000 megawatts of ROC adjustments. And from there, last summer, we reached levels of about 8,000 megawatts. And this just gives you some reference to history, how we have utilized these ROC adjustments. If we move to the next slide, please, that will have a different view of the ROC adjustments. And this is an organization by year, and is distributed by time of the year. It not only matters the frequency and the magnitude, but also when we are using these ROC adjustments. You can see that there is a more defined trend starting with effectively 2021. Historically, at least for the recent years, the target has been to ensure that we have enough capacity committed to handle the conditions around the evening peak. That has been our main concern when we really are in these tight supply conditions. And the magnitude, as you can see, has increased over the years, reaching the maximum in 2022, and that happens to be around precisely the peak time, out ending 18, 19, not only when we reach the gross net peak, but the gross peak, but also the net load peak. And when you see 2023, you are going to see that the distribution, the trend is fairly different, and that is because some specific deliberate changes that we implemented effectively in July 2023 that continue to happen up to now. And that is the reason you're going to see that it's a very well-defined trend of the distribution of the ROC adjustments that we have. Next slide, please. The trigger to ensure that we move into a more programmatic calculation of the guiding estimates to use for ROC adjustments was predicated on the events of the summer 2022. Over the years, we started with some operator judgment. It was up to the operator to define, based on the risk that they may see, what potential ROC adjustment they may need to have in place. Different operators may have used, to some extent, different judgment. We start guiding them by providing more information, more intelligence on the conditions that they may be dealing with, specific to the load, wind, and solar conditions. So over the years, we provided what we call these confidence bands. That was a type of higher end value of potentially how much uncertainty variability could exist in the load, the wind, and the solar. Eventually, by the time we have this in place for the summer 2022, there were effectively 3 data points that they rely on to guide them what the ROC adjustment should be. And these 3 points were no more than the variability uncertainty regarding for load, wind, and solar. The outcome of having these 3 data points is that eventually these 3 data sets were basically used compounded together to determine what will be the ROC adjustment. And it happens that these high-end confidence bands happen to be non-coincidental, but we were adding up, compounding them one on top of the other. And that is the reason that in the summer 2022, when you put all these 3 factors together, we ended up with ROC adjustments that reached the 10,000 megawatts. That was the time when the CAISO committed that moving forward, we would assess a better methodology to guide operators into these net uncertainty values that they could use as a guiding principle to effectuate ROC adjustments. And along that line, it was not only the day-ahead adjustments that were the focus of the effort. We understand that there are also concerns and a lot of discussion regarding, in general, the utilization of the load conformance across the market, day-ahead, HASP, FMM, and RTD. Next slide, please. With that, effectively, in the first quarter of 2023, we started an effort. We call this a pilot program. We wanted to assess, to understand the root causes, the drivers for which there was a need to use these ROC adjustments and also the real-time load conformances. This trend shows you a few critical points in time when different actions were taken. The reference is, again, the conditions that we have in the summer 2022 when we reached these levels of 10,000 megawatts of ROC conformance. Then we started effectuating this pilot, and we created conditions such that we explore the possibility of running the markets with no load conformances, no ROC adjustments. We did in isolation a couple of days in early April, May, and then when we felt confident about the drivers, effectively we used no ROC conformance for basically a month, somewhere between May through beginning of July. And that was during control conditions when we have load levels below 35,000 megawatts. Then when we enter into the summer, effectively in July, given the fact that we exceed that level of demand, we came back to a standard process. At the same time, now we have this methodology that is based on a similar methodology that we're going to be using for imbalance reserves, that is based on a regression-based logic. And that came together, and that is when you start to see, on average, that the ROC adjustments were quite consistent, anywhere in the range of 2,500 to 3,000 megawatts on average, daily average. As we start assessing the performance of the market based on these ROC adjustments, we found that happened to be kind of high, not much during the summer conditions, but past the summer, effectively October, November, December. We did some reassessment by the end of December to assess what was the reference to have this level of ROC adjustments. Effectively, we changed the methodology, and we can expand on those changes later on. And you can see that through the second half of December, the reference values that we use for the ROC adjustments reduced significantly given the changes that we implemented. Next slide, please.
Guillermo, could we just pause for a second just to see if there are any questions from the committee or online? It's great data. I had one quick question on the previous slide, which was when the different uncertainties were added, and and you pointed out that results in estimates that are overly conservative because, in a sense, I think as Scott has pointed out before, when you add up different uncertainties, that's in a sense assuming they're perfectly correlated. I'm just wondering whether empirically, do we see a strong positive correlation or some positive correlation between these different elements, or do they tend to be fairly independent, which would certainly explain why this would be overly conservative? I'm just curious what the data shows.
Yes, and I recall, Ben, I may not have all the numbers in front of me, but I recall we did that type of assessment specific to the conditions of the July 2022, September 2022, and indeed in the summer report of the September 2022, we put that type of information. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, maybe Amber have better memory than I, but I believe the realized uncertainty for these days when we have the ROC adjustments to be about 10,000, it was like a half of the realized uncertainty that actually happened during those days. So we are talking about 50% of the 10,000 megawatts or something along those lines. It was not to the extent that we projected to have with this summation of the different components.
Yeah, I mean, I can add a little bit about the correlation between the factors, right? Because you have load, wind, and solar that you're looking at. There is, of course, the correlation between load and solar that is there because we have so much rooftop solar penetration that's on the system. I think what we learned in the summation of the net load is that it did result in an overestimate. There was other factors that were playing in to that specific situation. We had a tropical storm that was moving up as well. So some of the estimates were in relation to uncertainty on cloud cover, both on the large scale side as well as the rooftop solar side of when that cloud cover would hit, what it would do with temperature, which ultimately drops load. And you saw some of those components interplaying, but ultimately it does, you need to factor in a net load uncertainty to help with some of the differences that are there. But there are some correlations that exist, and in that event too, there was days that the temperature drop on the load had a bigger impact than the reduction in the solar. And that's a very big timing thing from tropical storms, which aren't very common.
Right.
That helps.
Unlike on the East Coast where Scott and I live, where we're supposed to get almost 20 tropical storms this year. Thank you, Amber. So one other question, then I'll check with Scott and Jim in the phone lines. On page 3, Guillermo, you mentioned that there was a big change in the RUC adjustments in 2023, 2024. And I'm wondering, are you referring to the emergence of a morning peak as well as the overall average levels being higher? Or what did you mean by kind of a structural change in these adjustments over time? Was it overall level or was it the timing?
No, it was the changes to the logic, actually, to how we estimated the values. And I have a slide down the presentation, Ben, if you don't mind, I can cover that in a couple of slides.
I'll be happy to wait. Jim or Scott, do you want to, you have any questions at this point before we go to the phone lines?
It's good to go to the phone lines now. Thanks.
We have 2 questions on the phone line. The first question is from Michelle K.
Okay. Hi, Michelle.
This is Michelle. So can you hear me?
Yes, if you can speak up just a little bit, it's slightly faint.
So I'm just wondering if we're missing the forest for the trees here. Do you think that this really has to do with the emergence of a lot of low priority exports out of the CAISO system? The way I see it is, let's say we have 55,000 megawatts of RA resources in California, 45,000 megawatts of load. We don't want that 10,000 megawatts of resources to go out to external entities, and then we use the RUC adjustments to make sure we keep them home for reliability purposes the next day. So it's not necessarily the uncertainty that we're covering for, it's a reliability purpose. That's the way I see it. And this sort of corresponds with the emergence of, you know, ever increasing numbers of low priority exports on our system.
I wouldn't characterize it that way, Michelle, because our purpose is not to hoard capacity. Our purpose is that we have a load forecast. We know that there is uncertainty around the load, the wind, and the solar, and we need to ensure that we procure and we position resources such that we will have enough capacity to meet that forecast plus the associated uncertainty. Consequences of that could have implications of how much exports we clear, but that is not the target. That may be the consequence, the effect, rather than the cost.
Right, but if it has day ahead priority, then that's more destabilizing. So I also think that, you know, other balancing authorities have the ability to hold back resources, right? So we don't have that ability. We have a must offer for all of our resources, so they could definitely flow out. And it seems that there is a lot of uncertainty. So for example, when you guys cut the RUC adjustments last July, we did have problems, right? When you cut the RUC and the HASP adjustments, when, you know, a number of things occurred, we entered an EEA2. So it's very clearly a reliability tool. And I think if we don't think about it that way, we miss a lot.
Yeah, well, let me put it this way, and this is actually part of the discussion and the scope, because what we're talking about here is specifically one component that make up the RUC adjustment. Now, I have to tell you, there are other operational factors that may play a role. And I remember for the summer 2023, there may have been 2-3 days where we actually have RUC adjustments beyond the load, wind, and solar uncertainty. So there are, I would say, two big pockets of reasons for RUC adjustments. One is the one that we're discussing, specifically uncertainty about the net load. That is the point of this analysis that we are showing up. But there are other operational risks that at the end of the day, the operators will have to make a call how they want to position resources, right? Those risks could be, for instance, underperformance of resources. We may have some resources that we know that they have been failing to come online and they try to be online and then fail again. What are the chances that they will continue to happen with that trend next day? There may be some storage resources that we're projecting to have so much charge, discharge, and in the real time something else happen. We may have imports, exports performing in a certain way that was beyond what we expected from the day ahead. There may be fires underneath a transmission line that may knock down some imports available into the system. You name it. There is a whole spectrum of other factors that in the end could be an input for the operators to assess that, well, I need to have some caution on that component.
Right.
The component we're specifically discussing here is specific to the net load uncertainty.
Right. But if you look at your slides about when the operators are using RUC adjustments, they're using RUC adjustments during stress test system conditions for reliability. So I think we lose a lot if we are talking about the net load uncertainty. They're not, I mean, the net load uncertainty, yeah, it's probably really great in the spring, but we have some RUC adjustments, but they're really using it during reliability events, as other balancing authorities do, by keeping their resources home and not selling them off, so that they can address the between day ahead and certainly during stress system conditions where you can lose transmission lines, when you know, it's hot and you know, you can have larger forced outages. So I just don't want us to miss the main purpose of those large RUC adjustments would correspond with stress system conditions. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have to say, we have other type of discussions internal, and eventually we may have an opportunity to discuss this externally about the quantification and estimation of this other type of operational risk that eventually may be reflected as RUC adjustments. Thank you for your comments.
Thanks, Michelle. And for the call today, if you would please remind everybody which entity you're representing when you do call in, that would be is appreciated. I think we forgot to announce that Michelle Quito is representing the California Public Utility Commission.
We have another caller on the line, Chris Devon. Chris, you are now unmuted.
Yeah, thanks. This is Chris Devon with TerraGen. Thanks for the opportunity and the information here, Guillermo. I did want to ask, about this pilot program that you guys did back in early spring of 2023. As you can show here on the slide, that, looks pretty drastic and how we were able to reduce that. I think it was during certain load conditions where we didn't get it above a certain level. I forget the level that kind of triggered that. I just wanted to ask, does CAISO have any plans to try to explore that similar type of a program in the future?
Yeah, currently we are on our way for the second phase of this pilot program. So we continue to work on that. This is not a work that has been completed. It's still in progress.
Okay, so let me understand that a little bit further. I guess, does that mean that you guys are working on potentially putting in place, or that it's still in place right now? Sorry.
The pilot program to continue to assess the root causes is still a work in progress. We continue to work on that. The final objective of this is to ensure that we understand all the possibilities and potentially come with some enhancements either to the market, to the procedures, to ensure that we are utilizing these operator tools in the appropriate way. And this is not only for the day ahead, the ROC process, but also for the real time. Right now, I can tell you internally, we are going through this pilot program specific to the real time. So I'm sure we are going to be able to report back publicly in the next, or maybe in the next 2 MPPFs.
Okay, thank you. So my just to repeat back what I heard. So right now we're not going to be applying this in RUC. We're not going to apply these targeted reductions, but we're still potentially doing it in real time.
Yeah, let me tell you more openly, because this is kind of a moving target, right? Right now we are under the current assessment of this methodology for the ROC adjustments to account for net load uncertainty. That is still a work in progress. We want to see where we need to be at, and that is indeed part of the reason we're bringing this to the MSC to hear back their feedback. You can see that we have been very active trying to ensure that we have a persistent, solid, and robust methodology to determine the ROC adjustments for the component of net load uncertainty. We are working in parallel to assess the conditions and potentially estimates for other type of operational risks that may be in the end reflected as other type of ROC adjustments. And in parallel of that, we are also doing a parallel pilot program to target the drivers for the load conformance in the real time. This is part of our overarching assessment that we are doing for flexible ramping product performance that we have been reporting in the recent past. So all this is coming together regarding the assessment and the overall performance of the load conformance in the CAISO market. So it's still a work in progress, but we will be reporting as we get some conclusions on that. This is in the sense of a pilot program to really understand. And we have very controlled conditions when we apply, for instance, zero ROC adjustments, right? In some cases, we may have procured additional regulation or ancillary services to ensure that we have that extra caution. So it's a very controlled program that we have. Based on that, eventually we may turn into specific changes of practices or indeed market enhancement. That would be the ultimate objective, how we can be in a better place to utilize these operator actions.
Thank you for that. That was very helpful. Just a follow on. So appreciate that discussion on the pilot program and what you guys are planning to do with that. I did want to just opine here and mention that as we see this trend of increasing adjustments here, I just want to highlight that it does have, as we continue to see it at elevated levels, it does have a chilling effect on the virtual supply and virtual demand bidding and those conversion bids because of the allocation that's associated with these RUC commitments. So as that reduces the profitability of due to that allocation of those commitment costs that can happen due to these RUC load biasing, I think that it's just notable that might have some efficiency impacts on the market outcomes, and it definitely has impacted some of our behavior. So I just wanted to note that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. I don't know whether there's anybody from staff DMM can confirm that virtual bidding activity has indeed exhibited a dampening over the last year and a half as a result. Chris said it's happening at his firm, but something to look at.
I can tell you, Ben, that not in the sense of directly looking at the performance of the virtuals, but on the increased cost, because there is some type of allocation that goes to virtuals based on the RUC process, and we have seen some numbers changing there.
In terms of the allocation of the costs, now that the costs are something like 200 million a year or something, although there have been less recently. Thanks, Guillermo. I did see Amelia had her hand up briefly. Was there something you wanted to say, Amelia? Maybe it was in response to Michelle.
Nope, I got that. Thanks.
Okay, that's great. Yolanda, anybody else on the phone line?
No, both phone lines are clear.
Okay. All right, Guillermo, you can continue, please.
Yeah, thank you. Let me speed up a little bit. This is a similar trend. The point here is that there is a different reference that highlights, even though you have the same activities and actions taken during different points in time, the relevance here is the average of the RUC adjustments and the relative size of these RUC adjustments to the load that we are covering for, right? There is a dark marker that stands for the percentage of the adjustments relative to the load. And you can see that in the summer and past summer, in the last quarter, these adjustments represented on average up to 12% of the load of the system. I can tell you, you look at on an hourly basis, there were cases in which these adjustments represented up to 37% of the load for that specific hour. Next slide, please. This is a different view, and it's to highlight effectively how the most recent change to the guiding principles to the RUC adjustments has effectuated in the hourly profile of the RUC adjustments. The vivid colors, orange, purple, red, stand for 2022, and the different tones of blue stand for 2023. That is a very simple reference of comparing the previous year and the year before. And the most relevant comparison here is Q3 and Q4. You can see that in 2022, the target was typically towards the evening ramp and the peak hour of the evening. And as we change to the methodology, now the profile of the RUC adjustments follows more like type of net load, where you have a morning peak and evening peak dampening in the middle of the day. And if you contrast that in 2020, in the Q4 of 2023 versus 2022, that is where you see that dramatic difference of the trend change, just going from peak hours to basically the whole day. Next slide, please.
Guillermo, I just want to point one out. This is a great slide. The one thing I want to highlight for us to discuss eventually is, the big increase in the middle of the night. We got 1,500 megawatts in hours 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whereas we used to have practically nothing. And this is talking about October to December. And at the end of the day, looks like hours 20, 21, 22, 23. Again, we've got more than 2,000 megawatts of load adjustments, whereas in prior years we had nothing. And even with the new approach in Q1 24, you know, it looks we're still several hundred megawatts higher than what we used to be doing. So I think that's a significant, another significant element of these changes. It's great you have it in this graphic, and maybe we'll talk about it later.
Yeah, perfect. Yes, Scott, and I think you are hitting one of the key points, that the fact that we are using a methodology that is based on statistics, based on historical data and regressors, effectively means that there will be a value, low or high, for every hour of the day. Before, when it was more considering to some extent the operator judgment, they typically were targeting, I would say, net load hours. That would be solar hours, and that is the reason you could see this type of profile. And indeed, there is some type of internal discussion we're having, potential adjustments for the future, considering these hours where we really need to handle the risk. So that's a great point. Next slide, please. I will touch generally on this. I think I will defer to the forecasting team for the second part of the presentation if they want to elaborate on more details. But I can tell you, based on the implementation that we did in July 2023 of using this methodology similar to the imbalance reserves, and the effects that we saw post-summer months, October, November, December, we continue to assess the implications of using these ROC adjustments based on the regression-based methodology. And there were two specific changes that happened in the second half of December 2023. One was to reconcile the definition of the calculation. The DIM, the day-ahead market enhancements calculation, the imbalance reserve we are going to be using is predicated on this definition of finding the uncertainty of the net load between the day ahead and the 15-minute market. We were actually using the net load uncertainty between the day ahead and the RTD market. So we were going to the 5 minutes rather than the 15 minutes, and that gives you a more conservative value. That was one change that was implemented. And the second piece is
that seems, you know, it's to the FMM forecast with no load adjustment, right? That you're
correct.
comparing, right? But I mean, it's not clear why it's better to do that rather than RTD. I mean, RTD is the actual load. So why do you think that the adjustment's going to be systematically lower to the 15-minute market than to RTD, which is the actual load? And it's the actual load we have to meet. It's not apparent why this is should have an effect, or what's causing it to have an effect.
Yeah, it did have an effect. In practical terms, I think we see a significant difference of using one reference versus the other. I don't remember the values, maybe in the range of 1,000 megawatts or so.
That suggests to me that there's something else going on. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and the second change is that by default, we are trying to capture the uncertainty at the 97.5 percentile, right? There has been a lot of practical discussions in terms of whether that is the level of coverage we really want to have for non-summer months. This is quite of an open-end discussion. So effectively, as part of the changes of December, we move away from the 97.5 percentile by default to be more on a condition-based logic. And I think the forecasting team can elaborate more on the details on those ones. Next slide, please. Now, let me just go into the practical implications of having this type of ROC adjustments starting with the summer conditions. And I just pick basically a weekend that happens to be November 18, when we were actually chasing some interactions in the market. Here you have a simple comparison of the load forecast versus the adjusted requirement once you incorporate the ROC adjustments. You can see it's not going to be just a higher value. In some cases, we are effectively reshaping the profile of the requirement, right? You have a more significant peak in the morning hours relative to the natural load forecast. Next slide, please. And this may take me some time to try to unpack. What you have here is two pieces of information. One, that is the dotted line trend that shows the amount of the rock adjustments. This is the additional requirement we impose in the rock market for November 18 on an hourly basis. And you can see that the maximum was about 5,700 megawatts in our ending 9. Now, this is additional requirements imposed on ROC. ROC is going to commit dispatch resources that are already online to be able to meet this additional requirement. Now, this is telling you what type of capacity was used or schedules were used to meet that additional ROC adjustment. There are two groups. One is incremental, meaning there are resources already committed, dispatched from the integrated forward market. And ROC is going to leverage on those to basically move them up in the range to be able to meet these additional requirements. When that is not enough, now the ROC has the ability to actually commit, start up additional resources to meet that extra ROC adjustments. And the portion in blue stands for the additional committed capacity that the ROC market had in order to meet that requirement. You can see that the majority of the capacity has to come from additional commitments to be able to meet the level of the ROC adjustments. Now, there is a very interesting part that I have to highlight. This only tells you the capacity that was committed or dispatched or scheduled to meet the ROC adjustment. It doesn't tell you the full trip going from the integrated forward market all the way up to the final ROC adjustment. There is a mirrorless stop here where naturally, even if you don't have any ROC adjustments, ROC may still make incremental schedules, additional commitments to meet first the gap that is left by virtuals. Virtuals could in the end be net supply or net demand, and that is going to affect what ROC has to do. And then the difference between the load that was scheduled in IFM based on the bidding demand versus the level of demand that has to be based on the forecast. These are two components that naturally ROC is going to take care of even if there is no ROC adjustments. The portion that you see here, it's only the capacity to meet the additional ROC adjustments. It doesn't tell you what capacity was dispatched, committed to meet the difference between IFM and the natural ROC target. I can tell you, and I was unable to put that information in this presentation, on top of those, or actually underneath this level of capacity, the ROC market already utilized basically all the incremental capacity that was available from IFM to be able to meet this gap of the virtuals and the difference between IFM and the load forecast in the ROC process. So there are basically an extra couple of 1,000 megawatts that ROC has to dispatch and commit to be able to meet these other type of components. And that is the reason you are not going to see too much of incremental capacity here, because that was already consumed to close the gap between IFM and the natural ROC target. Again, this is only focusing on the ROC adjustment capacity that was needed to meet the adjustment.
Thank you. Is the gray that's below the line the unloaded capacity that is used up to meet the underbidding? Or is it something else?
No, this is very interesting, Scott. The negative one happens to be that we have to reduce dispatches of capacity already committed to make room for the commitments that we have to put. When you bring commitments, it's a discrete amount, and now you have too much supply. You have to deck somebody else to accommodate that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Guillermo, I was just trying to get my head around how you did this calculation, because it seems like there's a couple ways you could do it. You could just sort of look at all the incremental that you have available, and if the additional amount that the adjustment's requiring is greater than that, then sort of by default you have to have commitments. Or were you actually kind of rerunning this under an assumption of no ruck adjustment and just finding the solution that way? Okay, so you were,
Yes.
yeah, so this is truly
Yes.
the marginal impact of the adjustment.
Correct. We have to rerun the markets to be able to isolate the effect of the rock adjustments, because if you just look at the original solution that contains the rock adjustments, you only see the total, right? You don't know how much was because of the natural balance between IFM and rock and how much was for the rock adjustments. Indeed, there is a very interesting dynamic that we observe, and that is when you don't have rock adjustments, rock may give you certain commitments, typically for the peak hours. When you now impose the rock adjustments, those commitments no longer happen, because now the market finds that it can commit other type of resources to meet the other type of adjustments in many other hours of the day. So the commitments indeed change. It's not just adding more commitments, it's a different type of commitments that you have with the rock adjustments.
Okay, that was my second question, which was, this graph implies that absent the adjustment, there would be no commitments almost, because it looks like you got enough incremental for, but it sounds like there's actually a third category that's maybe not in this graph, which are commitments that didn't happen because of the ruck adjustments, forcing commitments in other hours. Or does the size of the blue bars here reflect the sort of net of that? Or is this just the additional imposed by the adjustment without sort of capturing the fact that there's going to be some reductions in commitment in other hours, or which are captured in this picture?
It is the delta, is the difference between the scenario with rock adjustments and with no rock adjustments. And that means that if there are commitments that were in one case over the other, these blue numbers are going to show you the delta. So if we shut down or we no longer committed one unit in the peak hour, that is going to be reflected here as capacity that is no longer available. Okay,
I mean, I guess
now that
it makes me think that we ought to be looking at the underbidding and the virtual supply. I'm struck by, if the middle of the night, hours 1 through 6 or 7, we've got virtually no unloaded capacity on the system. That's kind of remarkable to me. And if it's all due to virtual supply and underbidding, that seems like a problem with the bidding behavior and the virtual supply, that they're soaking up. We're using all of our unloaded capacity to cover it.
But does this say that this is we don't have unloaded capacity to meet the adjustment, but it doesn't speak to whether there was unloaded capacity to meet the generic RUC requirement?
Well, that's the point, that the generic RUC requirement is using it all up, and the generic RUC requirement is virtual bidding, covering net virtual supply and underbidding. So it means that behavior is using up all of our unloaded capacity, leaving nothing left for net load uncertainty, and that we have to commit all these long start units.
Right. I think at least for some of those days that we analyzed, that was the case, Scott, that there was incremental available coming from IFM that was already exhausted by the time we have just to move to the RUC, even with no RUC adjustments.
Right. So that tells me maybe we, I think that there'd be pretty high costs coming out of this that would discourage all this underbidding in the middle of the night or virtual supply. It'd be good to know what it is. Whether it's net virtual supply bids in the middle of the night, or if it's underbidding in the middle of the night, or if it's something else that's soaking up all our unloaded capacity. Because I would think that there should be quite a bit of capacity sitting down, well below its upper limit in the middle of the night.
Yeah. Well, this is still work in progress, Scott. We will be happy to report on that. I think we are on.
We can follow up offline, but I think I'm just pointing out it seems significant.
Okay. Next slide, please. Now, let me unpack a little bit more that message.
Excuse me just a second, Guillermo, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we might have somebody waiting to ask a question. I think Callie Wells is waiting.
Michelle just put a question into the chat too. That's basically about whether the dynamics of taking imports during the night might have something to do with the degree of unloaded capacity during these hours. That it is something to do with whether the import patterns, the timing of import patterns might also be part of this.
And I feel we should have units online to provide reserves and so forth, even if we're taking in imports, and the imports would tend to back units down to their minimum is what I think, but
yeah, the imports would have to cause a lack of commitment. I guess it had to be so extreme that you shut units down. All right, Callie's on the phone, sounds like.
She was, Callie?
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells. Yeah, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Quick question, Guillermo, and I apologize if I missed this in your discussion of the previous slide, but were all those commitments you showing, were those all long start units, or were some of those a combination of short and medium start?
I'm going there, Kelly. You don't mind for holding a couple of minutes for the next two slides. I will cover that.
Okay, nope, that sounds great. Thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, so from the previous slide, there was this bucket of blue that is commitment and gray that is incremental dispatches. If now we focus on the commitments that ROC made because of the ROC adjustments, this is the breakdown that you have. These are the type of resources that have to be committed in the ROC process to be able to meet the extra ROC adjustments. And the dominant color here is the blue that belongs to MSG. But in general, combined cycles, CTs or ST are still kind of gas. But that just gives you a sense of the nature and the attributes of the resources that the ROC has to rely on to be able to meet that ROC adjustment. Starting from the reference that we already consume some capacity to be able to meet the difference between IFM and ROC. And you can see, for instance, there are CTs that are committed typically for the peak hour, right? Hour ending 16, 17, 18, but the majority is relying on the MSGs. Next slide, please.
Guillermo, I have a couple questions. Are the MSG units here long start units, and how long are they? Are we talking about units that have 6 hour startup and times, or are they 1 hour, or what? You know, I don't know. You're just looking at these. I assume the combustion turbines are quick start, but I don't know about, are all the others long start, or what are they?
Yeah, I think there is a full spectrum of temporal attributes, Scott. There are some that are long start, there are others that are kind of medium start, and there are others that indeed can be kind of fast start. So we have all types, even for the MSGs. CTs are typically very fast start units, but MSG, you have a variety of those in the mix. And I try to capture that in the next slide, I believe.
Okay, one thing I want to point out, okay, that's good, but I noticed that we got a lot of combustion turbines that are available to put on in hours 15, 16, 17, 18, so we don't have to commit units, but we don't have those available in hours 9, 10, and 11. Why is that?
Yeah. I wish I could have a very precise answer to that, Scott. I would blame the nature of the temporal constraints in the market, right? You can see that in these hours, hour ending 9, 10, what we rely on is mostly the MSG units. I would say that once you take into account the 24-hour optimization, this is the type of combination that the market is finding to be the most economical one. And some of them have to remain online for the rest of the day, or for at least through the mid-hour of the day. And others are kind of coming in and out more quickly. So it's very complicated once you have that many units interplaying together. So I wish I could have a better answer to you.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like we should be able to commit less in hours 9, 10, 11 and use those greens that we've got in hours 16 to 18. I'd expect there to be less excess greens in 16 to 18 than in the other hours. So, you know, this looks odd to me. So go ahead.
Yeah. Next slide, please. This is a breakdown, and it's not many different groups of startup time, for instance. I was planning to do that, but I think this is more meaningful. And it's just the clean separation between what is rock binding and non-rock binding. Because if it is rock binding, it means given the time of the startup and the temporal constraints of the resources, the only opportunity for them to be committed is in the day-ahead market. And that is the reason they are rock binding. The other ones that are non-rock binding means that they are fast enough that they can be reoptimized in the real-time market. So they are committed in the day ahead, they are advisory. The last determination whether they need to be on or not is up to the real time. And here is where you can see how much of those are kind of at play in the different hours of the day. And you can see, for instance, in hour ending 9, 10, 11, most of that is rock binding. That means these were MSG units that were committed basically because that was the only time frame where they could be optimally committed by the day-ahead market. And in other hours, like the peak hours, you can see that the volume is less because you have more reliance on these faster units that is up to the real time to determine whether they are going to be on or not.
Yeah, but that's the thing that Guillermo, this is Scott Harvey again. This is the thing that doesn't make any sense to me. Because if we've got in hour 16, if we've got almost, 2,800 or something megawatts of quick start units that we can non-bindingly commit, why don't we have that much in hour 14 and 15? And that's, that's earlier in the day. How about in hours 1, 2 through 7? It seems like we wouldn't have to commit anything. So it seems there's something that needs to be explained about what's creating this pattern, because this pattern does not seem right to me. If we've got all those, I would think that we'd have a lot less non-binding units left over to commit in hours 16, 17, 18, and 19 than we would in any other hours of the day, because those units would be needed to meet load in hours 16, 17, 18, and 19. And the fact that we've got all these extra short start units in those hours, but not in other hours, just makes me feel there's something wrong here. That's why I'm asking these questions about the ruck logic, because these things don't add up to me.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I will try to come back with more insights on that, Scott. I see your point. I can tell you there are several conditions that I could foresee to play a role. One of those have to do with the fact that if these fast start units, in some cases, for instance, have a use limitation, right? They cannot just be on or start as many times as you want through the day. So in some cases, you actually have to manage how many times they can start in the day. That would be one simple logic there. And the second really has to do with the temporal constraint, right? Having these MSG units allows you to have this type of base load that may not look optimal when you look at in isolation for some hours, but when you see across the day. And again, I think the main component here is that, keep in mind, this is only the incremental to meet the rock adjustments. There were already commitments made and dispatches made to meet the difference between IFM and rack that may have already consumed some of those other pickers.
Right.
And
that'd be worth knowing, but I think we ought to run this down, because I feel it hard to believe that we got all that underblitting and virtual supply in the middle of the night. And, it'd be good to know exactly what is in the ruck logic that causes this, because maybe it's something we aren't thinking about that's having a very unintuitive effect in producing outcomes that are not what we expected. So it's worth understanding exactly why this happens.
Yeah, I will come back with more, Scott. And one more thing to just mention here. Keep in mind, the rock is a process for capacity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the dynamics that we have specific to rock is the fact that we account for the resource adequacy resources. So when we are making the determination of optimal commitments in the rock process, it makes a difference, because those that are resource adequacy resources effectively are going to be in the market with $0 cost. They have no incremental range cost. It's only the cost of the commitment that is going to be considered to determine if the unit is committed or not. The startup cost and the minimum load cost, but no variable range. So that, in some sense, is going to create some dynamics and in the optimization to pick and choose which one is the most optimal
Right,
cheapest
well,
resource to
I
commit.
agree, but that should drive it the other way, that would mean we should always be relying on the non-binding units, and that we should only be committing the units with commitment costs in the last resort. And I see these numbers in other markets, and that's what makes me think there's something weird here. And
Okay, I
maybe
have a
it's
homework to
probably
do.
perfectly coming out of the optimization, but it might be something in the optimization that's not working the way we intended.
Yeah, I will take it, Scott, and I make sure to come back with more consolidated answers to this.
Yeah, let's continue this offline. I think it is interesting. It sounds like we're not going to get to the bottom of it here. So why don't you go ahead, Guillermo?
Next slide, please. Let me skip this. I think I want to hit to the last point that is more relevant. Next slide, please. One more. And this is the effect of having the dynamics that we have discussed through this first hour of the presentation. This is one way to measure somehow the performance of the market, and has to do with what we call the bid cost recovery. And these are the payments to ensure that resources are made whole when they are dispatched uneconomically. And this is a relative breakdown of the bid cost recovery across the different markets, IFM, ROC, and the real time. And when you see the trajectory of the BCR for the ROC market anywhere between June through December, you can see that there was a significant increase of the bid cost recovery that aligns with the dynamics that we have discussed for the ROC market and the ROC adjustment. Next slide is going to give you a little bit of breakdown. And I have to tell you, these are kind of two slightly different variations of estimating the BCR by market, and has to do with how we do the math for settlements purposes. This one could be somehow more, it would be closer to tracking the BCR on the resources that accumulated the BCR. There are three panels, one for the IFM, one for the real time, and one for the ROC market. There are some complexities to isolate the real time from the ROC, because in the end it's kind of all together, but there is some way, a logic to try to track the ROC component. And when you look at the far right component, you have the ROC, and this more precisely gives you the sense of how much the BCR increased during this period of time that we have been discussing. In October, that is the most critical period, it was about 27 million of additional or total BCR that accrue in the ROC process. Next slide, please. And this is just a daily trend, just to give you a sense that that was happening not just because one single day that was bad, but it was a continuous, persistent trend. Yes, there are ups and downs. You can see that somewhere middle of October is when we saw the highest accumulation of the BCR, and we can continue analyzing the dynamics of the ROC commitments in that case. Next slide, please. And just to summarize, here are the elements that I think are kind of interesting to put in the bigger context. We have the ROC process to ensure that we have enough capacity to meet our load forecast. We have been using the ROC adjustments to ensure that we also have enough capacity to meet our net load uncertainty. Given the construct that we have for the ROC, we know that ROC doesn't provide you ramp. It's to ensure that you have enough capacity committed to meet your projections. Much of the ramp capability is going to still be determined based on the real time and by the real time market. We have seen that the ROC adjustments for the new approach have increased the BCR. We have seen increased values across the profile of the day. There are now ROC adjustments playing for the first hours of the day, for the last hours of the day, for the middle of the day when we may have actually oversupply to handle. And I can tell you, we have not concluded the discussion internally of what is the proper way to handle these rock adjustments, the guiding principles to use for rock adjustments. And a factor that we have to consider is the cost. And you can see that it's not coming for free. There is an associated cost reflected at least through the rock adjustments and the Bitcoin recovery. And we're in this searching mode of what is the right trade-off between the rock adjustments to account for the net load uncertainty and the appropriate cost associated with having that in place. This is still a work in progress, and we would be really happy to hear any feedback you have in terms of the practical implications of having this methodology in place. That's the component of this first presentation.
So thank you, Guillermo. This is Ben, and I'd like to foreshadow that Scott Harvey has a couple of presentations this afternoon, which are going to address directly or indirectly some of these points about benefit cost analyses and the costs or the reasons why RUC costs seem to have been higher. I wanted to ask a couple of quick questions and see whether the committee or the folks on the phone line have anything that they want to ask. On the previous slide, Guillermo, the daily BCR, let's see, slide 17, operator, could you go back one, Yolanda? Yeah, so you mentioned a persistent trend, and I kind of see, what I see here is that it's up and down, but it's kind of U-shaped, that BCR went up. I think that's natural gas prices in 2021, and then has come down. So by a trend, Guillermo, do you mean the recent trend since 2021 in a downward direction, or are you looking at something else in the graph? I wasn't sure what you meant by a trend.
Yeah,
this is all for this year.
Pardon me?
This is all for this year.
Yeah, this is June through December 2023.
Oh, I'm sorry. These are days, right? These are not years. Thank you. Okay, so at any rate, the trend is since October going down, but was going up before. What did you mean by the trend?
Oh yeah, there is effectively significant values for multiple days, right? It's not accumulation of BCR in a couple of days that makes the big numbers for the month. They are compounded over the month.
Right. This addresses a question I asked, Ben, about whether this was driven by a couple of outlier days. And I think Guillermo's point is no, this is happening on a lot of days. It isn't just a couple of huge numbers on a few days. It's big numbers on all the days.
Yeah, okay. So if you look at,
even if we got rid of the biggest days, we'd still have a big number.
So if you look at mid-October to mid-November, I see that it's really bouncing around 600,000 to 700,000. It's not going down to zero, and it's not going over 1 million. So that's what you mean.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Just going back to go to the next slide then. Just a couple things on the third bullet, right? You point out that this is absolutely correct. RUC doesn't necessarily guarantee flexibility being available in real time, and I'm wondering whether, in fact, there has been any shortage of ramp capability in real time. Have we had? Has this resulted? Has the reliance on RUC resulted in any flexible ramp product shortages, or this is hypothetical at this time? It could happen, but it's not happening now.
Well, actually, we did have the July emergencies of 2023 where we ran out of RAM capability very quickly in the real time. Even though we have no projections of such things in the day-ahead market, even though we have solid numbers of RUC adjustments in the day-ahead market, things just happen very quickly in the real time.
Okay, so it's not hypothetical, but it has actually happened enough to worry. And the very last bullet in terms of the what risk is being covered in the fall, spring, and winter with 24-hour adjustments, is the issue there that much more capacity is being committed than is actually needed, given the what net loads are actually realized. We've overestimated what is needed, or is it because of the the type of capacity that's available in the non-summer months that there's no problem covering net load excursions because we have extra capacity available? I mean, between the two, is it the estimation of the uncertainty, or is it the nature of the undispatched capacity mix that's still available to meet net load contingencies?
Yeah, I would say it's more about the second one, because for the level of demands that we have in the year, for this time of the year, we're really talking about demands that may be anywhere in the range of 28,000 megawatts, right? When our full capacity for the year may be in the range of 50,000. And yes, we don't have all the RA contracted capacity in the non-summer months, but there is enough supply in the system. So, and if many of those are going to be fast start units, RUC doesn't guarantee you anything new. It's just telling you, yeah, you have this fast start unit that you can start in the real time anyway. It's more about when, given the high magnitude of the RUC adjustments, you start going into this shifting of the generation mix, that now you have to commit these less flexible units, because that is the only thing that you have to be able to meet that level of the RUC adjustments. Now you end up in this different profile of generation into the real time. And in some cases, if you need to keep the units online for the middle of the day, now you actually may exacerbate oversupply, right? You are displacing now renewable capacity, because now you have to make a space for these units that cannot shut down.
Okay, so these less flexible units have been committed and kept around, and you're saying that there's not an issue with overestimating the amount of net load uncertainty that you have to deal with, that's not driving the commitment of these resources. And I know Scott's going to talk a lot more about this, but the issue is not the net load uncertainty estimation in these months.
I don't think we know that, Ben. I don't think there's any data that shows that's not the problem.
Okay.
I mean, the only way we know that is if we actually studied what was the net load uncertainty in October and November and December.
Guillermo, is that right?
Yeah, I think there are many facets to this, Ben. As Scott indicated, there is still a lot of work, and I believe the forecasting team can elaborate on that, trying to assess how good the coverage and the requirement has been in terms of the estimation, right? I can tell you, based on the experience that we have for the flexible ramping product, similar discussions to what we have been doing for FRP may be applicable also for the methodology currently being used for the imbalance reserve, right? And so the time of the day, the historical period, so there are many other similar components that may also be relevant here.
Okay, thanks for that. Let me check, Scott and Jim. Anything else you want to add or ask about?
Hey, Callie's on the line now.
Okay. Before we go to Callie, Jim, just make sure that you're not trying.
You will hear from me if I.
Okay, you're not shy. Okay, so Yolanda, can you go to the phone lines?
Hi, it's Callie with WPTF again. I just have actually a quick observation I was kind of wanting to get your guys' reaction on, related to the RUC BCR increasing. So first of all, Guillermo, absolutely fascinating data. Really appreciate you pulling all this together, especially on those unit commitments. So if the majority of those do seem to be RUC binding unit commitments, obviously one of the market impacts is that capacity goes into real time and it has, the potential to suppress real-time prices. Do you think that is maybe what's causing the increase in RUC BCR?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think it's a logical consequence, right? Because now that you have these blocks of supply in there, and the fact that the fact alone that you have BCR is an indication that the units are running uneconomically. So that is just a natural consequence, yes.
Okay, I was curious your reaction because that's immediately where my mind went, was that it's suppressing the real-time prices and now you're having the uplift. And then just a quick question, kind of at the beginning of this presentation, you mentioned that you guys changed the logic to the regression logic, which is very similar to what's going to be used for imbalance reserves. And then after that, you made some additional adjustments. I think, dropping down from the 97.5th percentile. I'm curious if the CAISO has been having conversations on whether or not similar adjustments will be made to the calculation of the IR requirement, or if you're going to kind of do something similar and put it in as initially planned and then evaluate.
Yeah, well, one of the beauties of doing this, Kelly, is that we are learning a lot now with the ROC process, what potentially could be applicable to some extent to imbalance reserve. Now, the only caution note that I would put here is keep in mind, right now we don't have imbalance reserve. What we have is a ROC process, and we're trying to leverage on the methodology to estimate the uncertainty similar to what the imbalance reserves would be. But we don't have the whole design, the whole structure of imbalance reserve to ensure that this is a full reference of what it should be moving forward for the day-ahead market enhancements. We need to be very careful to not make just a default conclusion that this is what we are going to see, because ROC is the current solution that we have, and we are trying to mix it with this more scientific calculation of the requirements. So they are just a different reference on point here.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. That was all I had.
Okay, thank you. Belinda, is anybody else on the phone line?
Yes, we have two other callers. J.K. Wang, you're now unmuted.
This is J.K. Wang from PG&E. I have a quick clarification question. Apologize if you actually mentioned this before. So when the CAISO started implementing this new methodology, is that replacing the operator's ROC adjustment? It means there was no operator load adjustment, as just this automatic one, or it's all together. You have both.
Well, let me characterize it this way. What we are trying to do is to provide operators with more specific, scientifically estimated guidance of what the ROC adjustment could be to account specifically for the net load uncertainty, so that they don't have to be making open-ended judgment of what the net load uncertainty is going to be. We're trying to give them that reference, and at the end of the day, it's their decision whether they use that or something else. Now, that is only one component. As I indicated, there may be other components, other types of risk, operational risk, that eventually may be internalized by using a ROC adjustment. This piece doesn't negate the potential need for ROC adjustments due to the other operational risks.
Gotcha. So it means it's not like additional, like you have one component plus the operator's determination, but it's like the operator see it as a reference and they will make their final decision. Gotcha.
Correct.
Okay, that's really helpful. Another question I have for you is, do you think this methodology will continue when DEMI goes live? Because it's basically you will have the additional capacity procures in the IFM, and this requirement, which is estimated as the difference between the day ahead and the 15 minutes, 97.5 percentile will be procured in IFM. Would you still have the same reference set for the operators in a ROC, or that will be adjusted accordingly at a time?
I would hold my answers on that, JK. I think you are raising a very good question. And I can tell you we are learning along the way by exploring the implications with ROC. That will give us a very good starting point to assess how we are going to position ourselves and the DIM moving forward. So I would take this more of a learning lesson to ensure that we're in the best place with the DIM moving forward.
That's fair. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks, JK. And there's somebody else on the phone line, I think.
Yes, Michelle.
Well, Michelle.
Hey, this is Michelle Keeter from the Energy Division. So I think I am also curious whether the implications of this for the imbalance reserve product. So I think my earlier comment was really that maybe RUC adjustments were really being done for reliability purposes, which kind of makes sense given that we want to keep those resources home from the day ahead to the real time. But it sounds like we're doing this now for these other reasons, and in some cases, or maybe uniformly, when I looked at your data, you basically procure 4,000 megawatts for imbalance reserve. That's what I saw in your study, pretty much in every single hour. I'll get that to you because I was thinking about that. But my two questions are: does this have implications for EDAM and DAME for fast start pricing? So if we're sort of over procuring these resources and they're uneconomic, does that mean that they're going to embed their startup and no load in those bids, and then we're going to clear sort of unnecessarily high prices as a result? So that's one question, and I guess you don't really have to answer it right now. And then my second question is, DMM has been saying that what we really need is the 6-hour look ahead, and that seems to be more that seems to be better for our use of MSG resources, right? Because these aren't long start units. Our only long start units are the OTCs, which we don't really run anymore. These units, well, anyway, I don't think, I would never call them long start units. So a 6-hour look ahead might be a better way to go. So just two thoughts. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks for Michelle. Anybody like to respond to that?
Scott would like to echo, I think, Michelle's point about the 6-hour and the 1 hour. That's why I was asking these questions about what the startup time of these units is, because it might be the operators, they don't bother making a RUC adjustment because they know they can start the unit if they need to. And that it doesn't take 16 hours to start. It takes, 1 hour, and it's longer than 30 minutes, or it takes an hour and a half or something. So they know they can wait until they see what's happening and then commit it. But now we got this logic that's locking us into, if the startup time is longer than 30 minutes, we gotta lock it in, or whatever we're doing, and I think that's, important, that there might be something, that's resonating with what I was asking about, whether we got something that's causing a problem there.
Okay. All right. I think we can now move on. We're not precisely on schedule. In fact, we're well behind. My understanding, and this I'll clarify it, is that we can go at least a half hour beyond the ending time of noon. I will confirm that, but at this moment, let's go on to the next presentation, which is going to be made by Amber Motley, who's the Director of Short-Term Forecasting at the ISO.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And it appears that my camera, of course, does not want to behave today. With that, I'll just roll. I'm sorry you cannot see my face, but in the effort of time, I don't want to troubleshoot the camera issues. This is really to expand further on some of Guillermo's deck, really focusing on the methodology. I know that you guys, as we were going through the market and what the market's been seeing, you can really start asking some of that methodology requirement conversation. So this is really to help support that. If there's further questions as we go through, let me know. Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about the background of where the requirement came from. We're going to review the performance of the model. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, but we're reviewing the performance of the methodology that's used to analyze the uncertainty requirement forecast, and then summarize some of the key takeaways that we have. Next slide. This slide is a little bit of a repeat from Guillermo's presentation. You saw the figure on the left updated all the way into current, which is great to see. But I think one of the things to know is the motivation. Why are we estimating and putting so much time into estimating the net load uncertainty? So we continue to see the growth of renewables, both in front of the meter and behind the meter on the system and enhance the logic to estimate the uncertainty that will be there on the net load with those renewables on the system. There's a lot of weather-driven resources now. You have over 15,000 megawatts of rooftop solar. In some, I think you have 18,000 megawatts of grid scale, 7,000 megawatts of wind. Really need to be able to estimate the uncertainty of those weather-driven resources and plan for them accordingly on the system. The DAME, we mentioned it a little bit, the imbalance reserve product, will be going live in 2026, but those renewables are on the system right now. Next slide. So in this presentation, we've already talked about what's being predicted and how it's being used. We're really going to zoom in and focus on how it's predicted. How is the net load uncertainty predicted, and how well is it being predicted? How is the methodology that we're using doing and performing in the time frame that's used for RUC? I'm not going to focus on the FRP components today. I'm really going to focus on RUC, the day-ahead time frame, and we've had some recent presentations at FRP before you to reference. Next slide. The timeline was talked about a little bit with graphics of where everything happened. Like we discussed, we did have additive uncertainty components used in summer of 2022. We really started focusing on renewable uncertainty during the winter of 2022 as well. And with that, we started seeing the need for more uncertainty estimates to be made and net load uncertainty to give operator awareness for operator decisions. So in July is when we put the imbalance reserve like uncertainty product in. And like Guillermo mentioned, that was the day ahead to RTD timeframe. There was a question from Scott that really talked about the difference between using a day ahead to FMM versus a day ahead to RTD timeframe. And one of the big differences is the granularity. When you go from day ahead, it's an hourly average, to FNM, it is a 15-minute average. When you go from day ahead to RTD, it's an hourly average to a 5-minute average. So it does have differences during the ramps. Those are important to capture as well, because during net load ramps, especially during the summertime, that is where you have a steep solar ramp off, and it is really where those differences play, and you need to be aware of them. Like discussed in 12/21, December 21st, we did change the methodology. I guess I wouldn't say change. We made it the more conditions-based values implemented. So it wasn't a change in methodology, it was still imbalance reserve. The difference is we're going day ahead to FMM now, not day ahead to RTD. And then we're doing condition-based values, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. Same method, quantile regression, the imbalance reserve method that's there, but we're really looking at the different percentiles to use, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. And then, I was going to talk a little about spring. One of the other questions that came up before I jump into the RUC methodology that's used is in the spring timeframe. So there was an ask of what we were observing in FRP is then factored into the RUC methodology. We are looking at the findings from FRP and the presentations there with day type removal, forward and backward sampling schemes, and those are in place for the RUC methodology right now. So you do see that there are lessons learned that we can take from FRP methodology and bring them over into the imbalance reserve, or what's now in the RUC time period. But they are two different timeframes. So you may see that the configurations between them will be different over time, but we are continually trialing them, testing them, and making sure that the best configuration parameters are used in both the FRP requirement as well as the RUC and then the future imbalance reserves. So one of the things that was really critical is to have the forward-backward sampling scheme, and then also get that bigger sample size and eliminate that day type on both of the products.
When was that
Now
implemented, Amber? It sounds like that's already been done. When did you make that change?
For RUC, we've always been using the forward and backward look.
Okay.
The day type change is what was more recently implemented.
Was that implemented in December or after that, or just?
In December.
Okay.
Yep. Good question. All right, let me dive a little bit into the RUC methodology. So this is in Operating Procedure 1210. Word for word on Operating Procedure 1210 is off on the right side. Guillermo's touched on this, so I'm not going to go in depth on it, but the operator has the ability to adjust the RUC as necessary. The big change that happened in December 21st is we started following a conditions-based value where you were using those net load uncertainty requirements. So the methodology in imbalance reserve is the 97.5 percentile. One of the things that we really noticed is a condition-based approach. Not use 97.5 percentile every day. During differing weather conditions, the operators have the choice of the percentile that they want to utilize in the RUC methodology. Some of those are detailed over on the right side. I won't go into them in detail, but the big percentiles that are being utilized right now, and I'll talk about them a little bit more in the next slide, is the 50th percentile, the 75th percentile, and the 97.5 percentile. These are values that are given to the operators to choose which one that they need to cover the net load uncertainty that exists on the system and the conditions that they are facing. Next slide. A little bit about, we had to have a little bit of math in here. So we wanted to go through a few of the definitions that you're going to see on the next slide as the metrics that we watch and the performance of the methodology here. So the performance metrics that we really are highlighting is coverage and requirement within this presentation. So we're looking at the average coverage over the hourly intervals. And the requirement, we're also looking at the average requirement over the hourly interval. We're defining uncertainty as the max difference between the net load in the FMM timeframe to the net load in the day ahead timeframe. Next slide. So before I get to the actual metrics that are covered, I'll focus your attention to the graph below. This is just a different visual representation of the overall requirements. On the left side, you see the daily average requirement in megawatts. You have trade dates on the bottom, 23 and 24 trade dates. And then we put a line, a vertical dashed line, really highlighting the 1221 change that went in to go to that more conditions-based logic. We also pointed out January 13th of 2024, and you can see that that's one of the days that the 97.5 percentile was used after the condition-based approach came in. If you guys remember, that was the big cold spell that occurred on the system, affecting much of the Western United States. So that was January 13th. So with that, we only have the metrics above are just focused on the performance of the sample period of December 21st to March 13th of 2024. And with that, you only have one sample point at the 97.5th percentile level. So I would like to call that out because when you're looking at performance and it's only one day, that's important to note. But on that one day, you did have coverage of 100%, and the requirement, the average requirement was around 2,400 megawatts. That doesn't mean that some of the other ones were higher during that day, but the average of the whole day was around 2,400. When we're running at the 50th percentile, we're seeing coverage at about 52% and an average requirement of about 723 megawatts. In the uncertain forecast condition, the 75th percentile condition, you're seeing coverage at around 68%. So a little bit below that target of the 75th percentile, and an average requirement of around 1,200 megawatts. You can definitely see when you look at the graph in this light where they float, right? You can see the 50th percentile days pretty clearly across that bottom dot row, the 75th percentile days on the little bit higher row, and then the 97.5 percentile days across the board. But overall, I think what would I take home from this slide? I take home that the methodology is doing a good job covering the uncertainty at the net load. This is looking at all hours. These are averages over cost. So that's always a caveat I like to put out there, but it is covering those different components from a modeling perspective. Next slide. One of the things that's really critical is we need to continue to assess the best methodology that's used in RUC, that's used in balance reserve requirements, that's used in FRP to protect against the net load uncertainty in the different conditions that exist. This is still something that we're working on. Guillermo mentioned it, and working on looking at the different uses across the board overall. But we're also looking at it from a perspective of where can we squeeze. I always use a lemon, right? When you're forecasting, I feel like you have a lemon, and you have the ability to squeeze juice out of that lemon, which I call accuracy or performance. But at some point, it gets very, very hard to squeeze those extra drops out when you're doing modeling. So we're working at the best ways to be able to squeeze the additional performance out of any one of those lemons to get us to the best net load uncertainty. And then as an ISO, we're also looking at the best ways to utilize those across the different projects, the different products that are out there. But the operator adjusted conditions really allowed for taking different insurance on different varying condition days. It gave the operators the chance to optimize what they need based on what's going on the system as it relates to protection to the net load uncertainty. So we will continue to evaluate those pieces.
Amber, I have a question about the conditions. Is the same 50 or 75% applied to every hour of the day, or can they use different percentages for different hours?
That is a great question, Scott. Right now, it is applied for all hours of the day. So if they do choose the 50th percentile, it's applied for all hours of the day. They have not done it different based on hour.
Thanks, Amber. This has been so have you looked at when these errors are occurring? Do they tend to be, so for example, with the 75th percentile, do the times when you don't have coverage, do they tend to happen at certain times of the day, or is it pretty random through the day?
The average versus the different pieces. Leisha's chatting me, so if she wants to come off mute, she can jump in. She really did run this analysis, so I'll let her speak to that question.
Yeah, I don't think we have exact metrics for that for by hour, but I don't think there is a clear, just from anecdotally looking at this data, I don't think there is a clear time of day when it's erroring. So we're just sort of reporting this coverage also across as large of a sample as we can. So evaluating all these intervals together, not necessarily looking at it on daily trends, but that's something we can do for the next update.
That'd be great. So it's always interesting to see whether there are certain conditions that are more likely to have misses than others, or whether it's consistent over the day. And of course, Amber, you've talked about different metrics before, for example, sensitivity, whether this 75th percentile is changing a lot over the day or depends a lot on conditions, or whether it's pretty much the same for all hours or all days, which then might result in being way too high at a lot of times or way too low at some others. But
and we do have, I mean, one thing that might help, it always helps me in relation to the illustration, Ben, is if you go, upright, if you can go 3 slides ahead, I think it's 3. We did put a couple sample days in as well to kind of show what the max hourly interval uncertainty is versus the average interval uncertainty against the recommendation value. I think it gives a pretty good picture. This is a normal day, so this would be a 50th percentile day. But it gives a pretty good picture of kind of where you can see the recommendation and then where you see the average and the max hourly interval uncertainty. I know it doesn't speak to the complete coverage, right? It's just a sample day, but it kind of helps show the trend a little bit of what you're talking about.
Right, Yolanda, can you go forward 3 slides to, yes, I think it's that one or the previous one, right?
Yep, that one, they each have, so the one before that is the 97.5 percentile day, the one that you had 100% coverage on, as well as some 75th percentile days. And then the one that you're on right now is the 50th percentile day, which is depicted at that bottom gray line to kind of give everyone an idea of what different days have looked like.
Okay, so the sort of thing I was talking about, this is just 3 days, of course. But if it turned out that coverage, this is the 50th percentile, if coverage was missed for much more than 50% of the evening and morning peaks, and for much less than 50% in the middle of the day, it might average out to 50% and look well calibrated, but there would be some improvements. But the rest of the days in those months might look quite a bit different than that. Can you go back 1 slide, Yolande? So I think what you were saying, Amber, is that the left day, the 13th, is the 100% day. I'm sorry, 97.5% day. And there's that was triggered for whatever, because it was very cold, but the operators weren't sure what was going to happen, but it looks like there was plenty of coverage, it turned out. Better safe than sorry if you're in a very unusual meteorologic situation. And then and then the others are 75%, and sometimes miss in the middle of the day or the night, and sometimes in the evening peak. There doesn't seem to be a pattern there. Anyway, so yeah, thanks.
You summarized that well.
And it does look like, and of course, unsurprisingly, it's the 15-minute interval either at the beginning or the end of the hour where you have the biggest deviation. And I imagine it's even worse with one used 5 minutes intervals.
Yeah, and I think that that's one thing that you just see in general with the methodology. It's doing 2 things. It is looking at the net load uncertainty that happens on the system in general, right? The forecast difference between the day ahead and the FMM or the day ahead and RTD. But because they are at different granularities, it also is capturing what the requirement needs to be to handle the granularity difference that's there as well. And I think that's where you see the predominant shape. That's when you look at Guillermo's previous charts, you really see the morning showing up. There are very steep ramps in the morning. Those steep ramps do have to be handled between the granularity differences, but the methodology is giving you both.
Great. Thank you, Amber. Jim or Scott?
I think that the table at the end about the 50% is interesting in that we've got a number of these hours where we're uncovered by 1,000 megawatts, but we didn't have a problem on any of those days, did we? So that we didn't need to do it in RUC?
I would have to look to see, I mean, the definition of problem. I think one of the things I'd want to look at in my interoperator is CPS1 scores, right? And see what the CPS1 scores were. We'd have to look at that more to see if there was a problem or not. But yeah, you are undercovered.
To diagnose that, I think, Amber. I'll go back and look at the reports for the days. I haven't had time since the slides come out, but, you know, maybe it'll show that the operators still have time to commit, units, and we had other units online that weren't cleared in Ruck that we committed later and, did okay, or maybe they had to take extraordinary actions, and that would be, informative, because I think part of the question is not just the forecasting, but, you know, what's the best way to deal with the error.
Yeah, I agree.
So Scott, that's actually a great foreshadowing of what you're going to be talking about in just a couple of minutes. Amber, I think you can go ahead and take it out.
I see one question on the line. I don't know if you want to go that direction. And then
sure.
I am happy to pass the deck on because I know we're running a little behind on time.
Yolande, who's online?
JK, you are now unmuted.
Hey, this is JK Wang from PG&E. Thank you, Amber. I have just one quick question. So in your slide 26, showing the summary of the metrics, I was wondering the lower chart, the average requirement, is that the requirements calculated by the program, or that's the actual RUC adjustment? Because to my understanding that the operators could make adjustment to the recommended values. So just want to check with you if the presented data is a calculated requirement or that's the actual RUC adjustment.
So for the graph that is on slide 8 within this one, these are the requirements, right? But like Guillermo talked about in the previous slides, the uncertainty requirement is just one component that can be covered within the RUC. Also, as you can see highlighted in operating procedure 1210. So there will be slight differences between these values and then the values that are in RUC if other actions are taken for other things.
Thank you. And I have another question follow up on that. Not sure if you know, because I sort of feel like if you have recommended value, the operators, they can definitely make adjustment to a higher value if necessary, if they feel like there's a need for more. But I wonder if the operator actually, during some cases, they choose to adjust the value down comparing to the requirement. And I wonder that because, you know, apparently in Q4, it seems that the requirement, the actual RUC adjustment was still remaining pretty high. And there was a reluctance, but you know, for the operator to adjust in the downward direction.
Yeah, so I think the slide up is actually a really good example of the operator discretion, right? So when you look at the conditions, west wide impact can run at the 97.5 percentile, and you see that they ran at that level for 1 day, and then they used operator discretion to adjust down for the 14th and the 15th. Even though the cold weather was still there. So they do have the ability to adjust down on percentile. They do have the ability to not use any of it. I think all of those things are things that we continue to work on, what the impacts are when they need it, but they have the flexibility to do either up or down.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much.
All right, Ben, with that, I will pass it back to you. And thank you guys all for your questions.
Thanks, Amber.
Amber, thank you so much. And so I'd like to welcome Scott. Scott Harvey is going to be talking about, looking in detail that the multiple possible reasons for RUC commitments and bid cost recovery to have been high. And I think this will probably lead to a discussion of, well, what is it that we need to look at in order to figure out what the reason is, whether it's the requirements or whether it's how RUC is done or the mix of generators. So thank you, Scott, for putting this presentation together.
Thanks, Ben. And I think the discussion we've had with Guillermo and Amber have addressed some of my questions, so maybe I'll be able to go through it a little bit quickly. So let's go to slide 3. And just quickly setting the stage, you know, the context here is that we do have these relatively high costs of BCR costs. As I note here, I think there are some questions we need to dig into about exactly what's being included in the BCR RUC costs, whether that's just the cost on the long start units, whether it's the cost on all the units, whether it includes the real-time revenues on the real-time units. But I'm not going to go into any of those issues. I'm just going to, for the sake of this discussion, I'm basically assuming it's all uplift on BCR. Go to the next slide. We focused a lot today in talking about the role of setting a 50 and 75 or 97% coverage, which I think is good. But I think we also, you know, part of this presentation is to focus about there are other possible explanations for this, and or things that are troubling about the level of costs and the patterns we see, some of which we focused on already, which is what is the cost, how high is the cost for the RUC? Why are we having a lot of long start capacity scheduled in hours in which you'd think there'd be a lot of unloaded capacity? Why is there a lot of long start units scheduled when you'd think we'd have short start units to commit? And then do we have anomalously high certainty requirements for the target coverage levels in some months or hours or whatever? Go to the next slide. The striking thing to me here is that you know, when you take these DMM numbers and put them together, I'm eyeballing it off the graphics, but it looks to me like we got an average cost of $13.40 a megawatt hour for the RUC, which seems like kind of a high number to me. Maybe it's reasonable, but it seems kind of high per megawatt hour. Go to the next slide. And you know, part of the reason it seems high to me is to provide context. As I went back and checked to make sure I wasn't wrong, but in October 23, the NYISO was a 30-minute reserve product, which they procure an extra 1,000 megawatts of reserves every hour of the day, and the average cost is about $4 a megawatt. So that's a third of what we're paying. The BCR cost would have been dramatically lower if we were paying $4 a megawatt hour, and that's a marginal price, not just an average uplift cost. And then, you know, another way of looking at it is DMM's got some data on, you know, what's the minimum load level, and it looks like it's around 1/4 of the RUC committed capacity. So that means that if there's a $13.40 average cost and the minimum load is only 1/4 of that, that means, you know, the average out of merit uplift cost is over $50 a megawatt on the minimum load, which again seems like kind of a high number to me. And then if the October FMM price was $50, and I pulled that out of the air, but look, I sort of looked at some of the numbers, but again, I was eyeballing things, not having the right number. Well, if that means that if the price was 50, that means the minimum load had to have an average cost of $100 a megawatt. And that's the average unit. That isn't the worst unit. That's the average unit, which seems high to me. So that's one of the, you know, the context for why I'm asking some of these questions. Go to the next slide. Now, Eric Guillermo's answered this. I posed one of these questions to Guillermo about whether it's driven by a couple of bad days or it's really a lot of days. And Guillermo's slide, I think, really, slide 17 answered this. So, you know, it's clearly not just a couple of anomalous days, it's a lot of days. But I still think a relevant factor we need to think about is the NYISO governs its procurement of 30-minute reserves by a demand curve. And we talked about the imbalanced reserves being governed by a demand curve. But we, you know, to what extent at the margin are some of these numbers by the last unit we commit has got astronomical uplift costs? And I don't know if that's the case. Maybe it just, you know, Guillermo's numbers suggest, you know, it isn't just a few days, it's every day. But I still wonder, that it'd be good to understand if it's the last few megawatts that are costing a lot. And there's some things that make me, there's some numbers we'll talk about later that make me think maybe it's the marginal ones. Go to the next slide. Now, I talked about all this already, that I'm troubled by the fact that there's high levels of long start capacity committed in the off-peak hours, that I'd expect that, you know, there'd be more unloaded supply. And Guillermo talked about the fact that we got the possibility that we got a lot of underbidding in those hours, and a lot of virtual supply. I think we need to study this and understand what's going on in those nighttime hours that we don't have unloaded capacity from IFM that we can schedule. And Michelle asked about the role of imports, and I think that's it's not clear to me that's the cause, but it's a good question to ask. I think we ought to ask, why is it that we're having to commit those long start units, and make sure that we're not biting ourselves with some little rule in there in the logic that's causing the wrong outcome. And one thing that after Michelle and Keto were talking, and Michelle and Callie were talking, it may be that we're sort of causing some of this problem ourselves, that if we're suddenly putting on an extra 1,000 megawatts or so of minimum, it's not minimum load. If it's 1,000 megawatts of coverage, that's 200 megawatts of minimum load capacity, or 250, and maybe in the evening hours it's 500. But still, that's a significant amount of extra capacity. It's committed after the IFM, so it's going to tend to depress FMM prices relative to the IFM prices. So maybe it's creating an incentive for virtual bidding because we're depressing the prices. And since Callie and Michelle just talked about it 5 minutes ago, I haven't had time to look at the data, but I think maybe we ought to think about, to what extent are we creating problems with virtual bidding and underbidding because we're putting on all this capacity and depressing the price in the FMM relative to the IFM. Now, that won't happen with the imbalance reserve product because it's going to be cleared in the day-ahead market, so we won't get that artificial difference. But I think it's, I'm troubled by the fact that we need to be committing these long start units in the middle of the night. So go on to the next slide, and I think Guillermo's pretty much covered this with the data he provided, and showing indeed that we've got a lot of long start capacity being committed in the middle of the night, which, as I said, is troubling to me. It might be good to look in a little bit into what's the minimum runtime of these units and whether they're astronomically long and whether that's creating some of the problems. But Guillermo's really addressed a lot of my concerns with his questions. Let's go to 10, slide 10. And this is, again, something I talked about. I'm troubled by the fact that why don't we have offline units that we could have committed without putting on long start units? And it just seemed, to believe this, we have to say, okay, well, there wasn't any unloaded capacity from the IFM, and all our quick start units were used up. Well, maybe that's due to underbidding, and maybe it's virtual supply, but we ought to nail that down. Just, Bill Hogan taught me, you don't just say it's probably due to X, you verify that it's due to X. And that way you will avoid a lot of mistakes. And I think we need to not just say, well, it's probably due to underbidding and virtual supply. We ought to verify that that's the problem. And if it is the problem, then that may guide us in what we need to do. And let's go on to slide 11. Then these are just some, go on to slide 11, operator, please. Okay. I'm thinking about why might this be the case that we've got all this long start capacity. And another comment that we came up in the discussion, and maybe I think it was triggered by something Michelle pointed out, but it'd be good to have some clarity about exactly what kind of start times are used to commit resources in RUC instead of waiting until stuck in RTPD. And I'm struck by the thought that maybe the operators knew that there wasn't a problem in the earlier hours of the day because they just start a unit a little earlier and it could come online, and it was only going to take an hour or so, and they could see Ben did analysis previously talking about how far in advance you could see these big errors coming. And maybe we by making it turning into a model, we've actually made it less accurate than what the operators were doing, because the operators were only worried about, do I have enough at the peak? Because the rest of the day I could just start units early. And I know I don't need to worry about 30 minutes. I can see the problem coming 2 hours in advance for the load forecast error. So then maybe we need to, this is something that we talked about in the context of DAME and EDAM, MSC and DMM and stakeholders about, you know, first the CAISO is going to have 15-minute capacity and then it's 30-minute. And you're like, we don't necessarily need to have capacity to be started quickly to cover the uncertainty. That it may be, you know, and it may be, maybe the lesson we're getting here is that being real and flexible about it and saying, oh, it's got to be able to start within 30 minutes or 40 minutes or 15 minutes is backing us into real high cost solutions, so that making it simple that way is really going to be expensive for ratepayers. So again, I think we need to figure this out, because maybe it'll change the way we think about some of those choices in DAME and say, well, maybe we really focus on a 1 hour product, 1 hour notice product, or a 2 hour notice product. And it'll be a lot cheaper for ratepayers to do that rather than putting a bunch of long start units online every day like we saw in October. So I'm worried about that.
Scott, could I jump in here for a second? Because I think you're on the next slide, you're going to be going to a different thought. So I really have to agree with you on this point that doing RUC for all 24 hours conceivably might bias you towards maybe slightly cheaper long start units. You just start them up and keep them up for what you think is, what the model thinks is the need for 24 hours. But in fact, there's going to be, you know, as you get into the day, you might see that you don't have that need, but you're stuck with it. Or you might see that you need more. That RUC process doesn't account for the optionality that you have with the shorter start units, the ones that you can start up in stock and or a couple hours ahead of time. And even if they're more expensive per unit of RUC capacity you put online per hour, you might need them a lot less because you take advantage, as you just pointed out, of, you know, that lead time. Or if it turns out that you just don't need RUC capacity for a good part of the day, then you're not stuck with it. So that's the difference between optimizing over a single forecast and optimizing in a way that recognizes that there's uncertainty in how much you'll need, and the optionality of shorter start units can be really worth a lot there and save you a lot of money, but is not considered by the way we do RUC now.
Yeah, well, it's actually RUC considers short start units, but it doesn't distinguish between 1 hour and 6 hours.
Right.
And anything that's more than the definition of short start is lumped together, and we have to, and they're committed. I mean, that's the main thing, is they get a binding commitment. And that's I think is the problem. Do we need to give a binding commitment to those units, or is it something we can wait and let it happen in stuck if we see the problem? Because if you're chasing a 2.5% probability, that means on 39 to 40 days, you don't need it. And so we don't want to commit it. I mean, even from an emission standpoint, we don't want to commit a long start unit on all 40 days when we don't need it. Instead of the one day we need it, we turn it on. And
you may see that, you know, by the middle of the day, you see, oh, in the evening, we do need it today, and you still have time to react. But the other 39 days, well, for a good portion of the days, you'll see, oh, we don't need it, so you never do start it. And that's how you save money in emissions.
Right. So that's why I think this is, you know, important holistically to not just look at the forecast, but to look at every piece of this and understand what's causing the high costs and what's causing us to commit units in the middle of the night, and what's causing us to, you know, to go to such long start units. So, you know, this is a list of things I talked about, you know, and we've talked about it now. And why don't we go on to but Jim, did you have anything? And does any of the stakeholders, I know I went through it fast because I wanted to catch up a little bit on schedule. So we can pause now since we're almost at the end. And does anybody have any questions?
I see Michelle has her hand up.
Yeah, Michelle Keto from Energy Division at the CPUC. Just any thoughts from the CAISO about whether it's possible to get this data and the time frame where we can discuss it? I mean, because we are moving forward with DAME, and DAME does have imbalanced reserves, and it also does have implications for fast start pricing and other things. So I'm just curious whether they've thought about how long it would take to get this kind of information, because I think it would be really useful.
I mean, sure, this is Guillermo. Yeah, we are analyzing that right now. So I think organically is going to be the point where we can share with participants. I would expect that the next natural opportunity to discuss this in detail would be the upcoming NPPF. But depending on the time, we can try to do something more targeted. But what I can guarantee you is that we are looking at this as of now. So it's not going to take longer than what is needed.
Just to be clear, you're also sort of looking at the startups, min load, time for units that have to be off. I mean, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. And I need to let everybody know that we do have the phone lines available for as late as 1:30. Now, I don't want to threaten us with staying that late, although this has been a terrific discussion. I think we're very likely with two presentations after Scott's to go beyond 12:30 Pacific time. I think 1 o'clock might be a more reasonable time. And this is recorded, of course. If you can't stay on, you can enjoy it at your leisure with a bowl of popcorn in the evening. So, Jim, do you have something you want to say?
Nope.
Nope, Jim's happy. So, if there's nobody else online, let's continue, Scott.
You're on mute, Scott.
Yeah, I thought we were getting some feedback, so I silenced myself. Go to the next page, please. So the final topic is, I think we do need to look at the Mosaic model and how well it's performing. What is it telling us in these nighttime hours? Does it really think that we've got it seems to think we've got a significant amount of uncertainty there. And I think it'd be good, we can text that. We can look at, okay, historically over these 3 months, that's 90 days. And we got a bunch of, 5 or 6 nighttime hours. So we got, 500 data points. How does it look for the amount of actual observed uncertainty and these procurement numbers we're getting? And are we really running into this problem? So I think that's a question to look at. Now, Amber explained that they, which historical look back period they've been using and all that. I think it's important to provide that when we're talking about these methods so that we can all keep track. The stakeholders and the MSC can understand what the moving parts are in these different models and understand what choices they might be. I mean, the 90-day forward and 90-day back, still for October, it's looking back to July, August, and September. And then it's looking forward to November, December, January. So maybe that's part of the problem or whatever. But 90 days forward might be for the prior year, but still it's not October. And, I continue to talk about maybe we should be looking back more targetedly to the similar months. So that's why it's important to describe all this stuff. But I'll wrap it up there. And if there are any final comments, we can take them and then move on.
So Scott, I agree with your points there. They're all great, and I thank you for assembling these questions and comments. So just to tie in with Amber's presentation, she had her last couple of slides showed a sample of days, 6 days. And the slide that shows the 50% days, that's only 3 days. So it may be entirely unrepresentative, but on those 3 days, it seemed to show that the requirements were had a higher probability of being inadequate during the morning and evening peaks, and that in the middle of the day or at night, that the requirements tended to be higher than what the net loads actually were. That was just a sample 3 days, and so can't conclude anything from that. But you could look at as you suggest, I think as you suggest, Scott, you could look at that entire multi-month period and say, is there a tendency to overestimate what's needed in the evening? And is when you're falling short, does that tend to be during the peaks? So on average, you're getting 50%, but it really depends on the hour of the day. So looking forward to the further analyses that that Amber and her group talked about. So I don't see any additional comments. So I think at this point, we can go to the next presentation, which is very appropriate, you know, given what we were just talking about, which is, I think it's Amber and the group again. Excuse me while I pull that up. Mosaic.
Yeah, Tobias will be giving this presentation, Ben, too.
Oh, that's great. So, really appreciate all of your team and what they've contributed. So, okay. And we're going to be learning here about the metrics that you might use to evaluate performance, and you have an aggregation that you propose that you think is relatively clear to communicate and is informative and discriminating among different approaches. So,
right, yeah. Thanks for that. I am Tobias Steckel, so I'm a forecast model analyst in the short-term forecasting team. So yeah, I'm going to go through these elements. So we could go to the next slide. So this is just a brief outline. So we're going to talk about the problem statement, even though definitely got a fair bit of implication of that from the last 2 hours. Then we're going to go through this scoring proposal and then an illustrative use case. So next slide. So I plucked this from a previous presentation that we made. Of course, where we actually are is kind of in this last tile of working towards enhancements and implementation in 2024. But I think what I wanted to do is to shift the focus back onto a couple steps back to review performance and identify opportunities, and to really interrogate this review performance, something that I don't think we've precisely nailed down to this point. Next slide, please. So again, this is a familiar slide. The idea being we have a predictive model and we have an application, and to really one of the ways of modulating how valuable this is to know how well it's actually predicting, said product. So just showing this again for context at a higher level. Next slide. But then the $1 million question is, how do we actually say how well is the model predicted? Next slide. Let's go to our problem statement here. So why is this currently a challenging task? It's challenging because we're broadly tasked with accurately predicting net load uncertainty while minimizing cost and maintaining reliability. So comparing this objective between alternative models is difficult. For one, there's no single observable metric that can capture this. And then it's further complicated when considering peak time, up versus down, your percentiles, and multiple BAAs that this impacts, and seasonality. So, what time of the year, or if you're looking at a whole year of performance, et cetera. Therefore, the ISO is working to enhance the analysis to, 1, definitively observe, and 2, to communicate a better model. With that, we're proposing an analog for scoring this performance called H-score, which is in reference to hierarchical score. So next slide. That was a very wordy slide, so I've given you guys more pictures. We can spend some more time on this because this is really a graphical abstract of what we're trying to accomplish. So using these two ideas that we want to observe and to communicate the performance, kind of proposed this spectrum here in the middle of the screen. So you have your ways of measuring performance. So in-sample metrics really is the farthest left, most simple way you can describe a model, going all the way to the right where you have something more of the output of, the actual full network model or that, that sort of thing. So there's this spectrum that moves from left to right and simple to more complicated, and you have your characteristics that kind of move in the same direction where green is of course good, red is bad. So that's kind of some characteristics that I'm putting down there. And I want to use this as well to kind of illustrate some of the struggles that we've had over the last couple of years and over the last month to describe whether or not we think a particular model is doing a better job. So these, if we look at the metrics, which is kind of where we've been, at an individual metric level, been communicating the performance over the last, over the last couple of months. We have, they're kind of intentionally meant to be small, but the idea is that in this first technical paper that was released to the public, we would show coverage and we would show mosaic coverage and histogram coverage for all the impacted BAAs, but these were kind of presented as separate entities. And obviously that's a problem because you don't really know what metric is driving the decision. So moving forward, we started this approach where we try to entangle the concepts a little bit more. So we had this Pareto of two particularly important metrics, which would be coverage versus the average requirement that was calculated, and that helped to kind of show this evolution more so with those two metrics. But the problem there being that we can only really show one balancing authority at a time, and it impacts about 20. And then in addition, there are these concerns. I know Ben has brought up the hourly concern, like time of day concerns. In addition to that, there's an up and a down requirement. So there's your problem there. And then moving forward, I think the most recent presentation that we've given, we showed this more relative approach where we can show all of the individual BAA models and how they've changed with a particular model change. So that was helpful, but again, you have to show a different one for the up requirement and down requirement, and we're still only talking about two metrics to drive this decision process. So that's like I think that's an archive of how we've communicated this, and what we're proposing is kind of this picture in the middle where we can show one distribution where we have alternative models on this, and we have this distribution moving from the left to the right on the x-axis that is basically your weighting more towards cost-based metrics, and then moving to the right and weighting more towards reliability-based metrics. And you can see the whole of this distribution for these different alternatives versus the benchmarks in one figure. So with that, I'll move to the next slide.
Tobiah, I just, this is Ben, I'll just jump in and just foreshadow that what Scott will be talking about in his presentation after yours is a proposal of how you might start having one further on the right that shows cost implications of different approaches. So your presentation and his complement each other's nicely. So I mentioned that because I know we're going long and I really want people to stick around for all the presentations or catch the recorded version later if they can. So anyway, back to you.
Yeah, thanks. I thought of that too. It's kind of right of the H score where you interrogate whether or not it's clearing and right off of that the actual full network model running to see those results. So yeah, thanks for that observation. So this is meant to just be a high level overview, and this we're working through and want to get feedback on these specifics, but just going to plow through this blueprint essentially. So where this starts in this is kind of tied into when we've been at the MSC before and other outreach activities like that. You decide all the relevant metrics that you care about. You kind of assemble them and then map the metrics to these kind of more high level categories that I think we've talked about in the MSC as proposed, where we have calibration, informativeness, and cost. Calibration, I said before, kind of reliability. That's really going to be more tied to the reliability aspect. Then after that, we bin the model performance. So we can actually flag times a day, such as peaks. That's a big one in this industry, whether or not we care about ramping, that sort of thing. Then we have directional considerations, which is also percentile here. So how does up perform? How does down perform? The sample period length. So are we scoring an entire year? Are we scoring a particular season? And then in addition to that, we have the breakout of the individual performance of the different balancing authorities. After that, then we normalize all these metrics, and then we weight the metrics in reference to these different bins. That's where the hierarchical comes from. And then we generate benchmark forecasts. So a naive, a histogram, and a perfect model. And the naive in this case being the most recent available observation of net load uncertainty that we can use. So in this case, it would be basically about an hour lag of what that observation was. So next slide. And I'm just going to go through a use case just to show it, not trying to convince anyone of anything. This is just illustrative. So next slide, please. So the idea is now you can show this spectrum, like I said before. On the far left, you have cost, green being cost, and that's the only consideration. Going to this far right, where you are only considering calibration, and in the middle, you pepper in some informativeness. I think this has using those two as bookends makes more sense to kind of visualize it. But this is just illustrative to show how it performs over this distribution. And on the bottom left, again, this is important for feedback that we want to hear. Is obviously there's an important consideration of where you map particular metrics, and some of these we've presented on before, but I am just showing them all in this case of like a proposed weighting or like a proposed mapping of where they go. So burn this. Sorry, yeah.
I'm sorry, Tobias. Quick question. So, you're weighting three categories differently depending moving from the left to the right, and within a category, if I look at your table on the left, there may be 2, 3, or 4 individual metrics within a category, and those are equally weighted within the category.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And it looks like there are
as like a default. That's something that
Sure.
could change as well, but as a
Could
default.
play with those. There are 4 categories in this table, but 3 categories are being weighted. Let's see.
Yeah. So usability was just that it's not relevant to here, but it's just another proposal. If this is something that we want to consider, this has been very detached from the realized results you would get when you model, because this is like how people consider how easy it is to use the requirement. So yeah, usability is not really being addressed here. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Continue. Move on.
All right. Then let's move to the next slide. So you got to burn that picture into your retina because now we're taking the x-axis from those weightings, and that kind of informs whether the dot lands for 4 different models that you see on the screen now. So the important consideration here is that this is golf scoring, so the lower is the better. And when we move from left to right, from cost to calibration, you can see that the spread increases, but the particular takeaway that I want to show, just illustrative, is that we can see one dominant model over this spread of, or over this distribution of your different category weightings. So that's just the idealized scenario. But if we can go to the next slide, we can jump back to this. But the conclusion being that through this methodology, in really refining how we do the weightings, that we can robustly observe and communicate one model being superior against alternatives, and also take away different other conclusions as they come out. And that's all I got.
Okay, Tobias, thanks. Yeah, this is Ben, and I say that I wholeheartedly agree that when you can have 12 or more metrics, it can get very confusing, and that one way to simplify things is to have an aggregate metric, a weighted one. But as you obviously realize, and you show here, the weights can then matter, and so this is an ancient problem that Benjamin Franklin even worried about. How do you weight things? And weighting really matter. The weights really matter if it turns out there are trade-offs. There are some methods among these 4 methods that perform really well on some submetrics, but maybe other methods perform much better in other submetrics, so the weights really matter. And the danger of an aggregate metric, and you always want to test this, is to take a look and make sure that one of these methods doesn't have some advantage or subset of advantages that might be important to some people. So imagine, for example, that once within, for example, calibration, you can have overall calibration. And as Scott and I have been mentioned a couple of times here today, something that's calibrated on average well, 50% hits 50%, and when you want it to hit 50%, and 75% when you want it to hit, does well over the day. One such method might do really poorly in some periods and really well in other periods, while another method might be better at being consistent across hours. So you could have a calibration metric for each hour of the day, or for evening, in the middle of the day, in the evening, and that now suddenly you have several calibration metrics, and you'll want to check whether some methods are actually doing better across the board on those. It could be that this weighted H might possibly hide some very big differences in how the methods perform on some of the dimensions. So you'll want to raise the hood and kind of poke around and see whether, I guess it's the turquoise, green, and purple and violet ones, are they, across all 10 metrics or however many, is the purple one consistently better or just as good, or whether the purple one might have some disadvantages, which perhaps maybe wouldn't lead you to choose something else, but might also suggest that, oh, well, the purple's disadvantage, maybe there's something we can do to address that issue and to make it truly superior in most of the metrics. So this sort of overall weighted metric is a good place to start and perhaps can help you eliminate, you show that some methods are clearly inferior, but if it turns out that a handful of the methods each have important advantages and behave very differently, for example, in calibration across the day or something else, that may be information that's important to understand and communicate. But it looks like, so I'm wondering whether you've been doing a lot of testing. You show 4 methods here on slide 11. Whether you've been testing a lot of methods, and whether you have a sense that, that a method that's good in one metric tends to do well in the other metrics, and so you have this dominance, which makes it easier to choose, or whether you see situations where some method does really well on some metrics and some other method does really well on others, and so you might have to think about which metrics are most useful, or talk about that. So what have you found in testing it thus far? Does one tend to be best, or do you find that that there are trade-offs among the methods?
Yeah, I mean, to speak candidly about it, I think the part of where I want to kind of back up is since this is kind of higher level, is we weren't necessarily drilling down to these different levels, but one of the levels that kind of help guide is that to bring this concern to the different parts of the day. So just as the default in obviously a work in progress is that we care about all hours. If we just think about one day, we care about all hours. That's a very important consideration. And we care about a peak, either whether it be a net load peak or a load peak. And the idea of these results that you see off the bat is that, I have these different parts of the day that I could split up, and I'm always weighting all hours and then peak hours, and then so those kind of you inherit some of that, and obviously there's room to play around, but that's just like a default consideration I had. So that's part of the hierarchy other things that I've seen, there's definitely see the trade-off. I think the obvious thing here is when we think about what you're binning in the cost. So I had the mapping up before, and I don't know if we should just get to a point of just looking at requirement versus exceeding speed in that category. I don't know if that's appropriate, but what you'd see if you just look at requirement as driving the cost, then you have your naive forecast at that level when you're only considering cost becomes the best model automatically because it's the lowest magnitude. So,
right.
And I think that's been a nice exercise to see these things that just don't pass the human test when you look at it. So, yeah.
Right. Okay. Tawaya, thank you very much for this presentation. And let me just see if there's anybody who, whether on the committee or anybody in the phone lines wants to ask.
Amber's had her hand up for a while.
Oh, Amber. Thank you for noticing that, Scott.
No worries. No, Tobias doing a great job. I think the only thing I wanted to emphasize is a couple points on this, and then I really want to pass off because I know we're getting close to 1 o'clock, is this is to analyze the model performance, right? It's how we're forecasting the uncertainty requirements. How is that forecast model doing as we look at some of those critical time periods? There is the opportunity for trade-offs. I think the other thing I wanted to emphasize is that because we're coming to one score, it will help with the communications of why we're making changes the way we are. But the additional detail that we've showed before is still available, right? And it still will be heavily looked at before making any conclusions of changing that overall model structure. But we just want to make sure that as we're analyzing model performance, that we're looking at it in a holistic sense, taking into consideration all of those integral pieces that are important to everyone and their regions, but also have the availability to go and dig deeper before recommending the change, and then come with those pros and cons to everyone. So I think that's the high level, but it is really focused on the model, not how the market is using the model. And with that, I will pass it off because I think it's a good transition to Scott. So I'll pass it back to you, Ben.
Yeah, it's a perfect transition, actually, Amber. Thank you very much. So, Scott, you get to clean up here. Well, I guess it's fifth, but close enough.
Okay, thank you, Amber. Thank you, Ben. So what I'm doing here is throwing out some very preliminary thoughts. First cut of ideas based on the discussion as Amber developed her slide, and we talked about this, and there hasn't been much time for discussion with the CAISO or with the other members of the MSC, so these are sort of a first cut starting discussion. Why don't you go to slide 3? And the high level concept I have here is the conventional way of looking about whether a methodology is good like this is what's the cost and benefits. And we've got costs here in terms of the benefits, in terms of improved reliability. And we've got costs in terms of what does it cost us. And, you know, that's teed up well by the discussion the first hour today, which is about how much it's costing us. And that gets into the question of if your methodology is over forecasting a lot, it generates costs. And you got to take a consideration, because one of the hard parts, the hard comparison is something that has better coverage and higher costs. If one dominates and it's got better coverage and lower misses and lower cost, that's an easy choice. But I think we, you know, coming from my perspective of working a lot on this problem in another area in terms of collateral coverage, you know, you can always have 100% coverage with huge amounts of collateral, but there's a cost, and that's what we've got here. Now, I'm tend not to think of the coverage metric as the CAISO is using it as the one we should use, because that weights equally whether you're off by 1 megawatt or 1,000 megawatts. You know, I think the amount, it's more a bigger reliability problem if we're way off than if we're a few megawatts off. So let's go on. I'm going to talk first about the benefits, and then I'm going to talk about the cost. And go to the next slide, please. The terminology I'm going to use is we got the actual uncertainty, which observed. If we go back and we're looking at how a design is performed, we can see what the actual uncertainty was in each hour and each day. We can know what the model predicted. We can know the amount of coverage that was covered in RUC, and this will be equal to predicted. It'll be equal to predicted unless we don't have enough resources in RUC. And if RUC doesn't clear, then we've just got the amount that was covered in RUC. And then an element that's very important to discussion this morning is how much capacity was actually cleared in RUC, because that's the only thing that has a cost. And now we got into this discussion today with Guillermo about, you know, do we have a problem with there's no latent reserves on the system? There are no short commitment units. If that's the case, then cleared is going to be the same as covered. And you know, there isn't going to be any safety range. But I think, you know, what I'd expect to see is actually that there's going to be a range in which you've got free coverage, and then it starts getting expensive. And so it's when you have to start committing long start units to cover uncertainty that it gets expensive. So go on to the next slide, and this is just more of these definitions, and you know, the key consideration there is if the actual is less than the difference between covered and cleared, which means if actual is less than that free capacity, then our methodology doesn't do anything because all we needed was the free capacity. So the methodology only produces a benefit when it actually puts some non-free capacity on the system. Now, if covered and cleared are the same, then, you know, it's just actual. But if they're different, then we need to take account of that. And then the value is the benefit of covering uncertainty in RUC. Go to the next slide, please. Now, what's the value? You know, one way to do it would be to set a single value of 1,000. And that would be relative, you know, very easy to implement and reasonable. But probably, you know, I can see a view that it'd be better to have at least one tier of like small amounts, small misses don't matter, that the operators can deal with 50 megawatts, they can deal with 100 megawatts, that's not worth spending $1 zillion for. But what matters is, you know, that doesn't have a huge reliability benefit, so that shouldn't be worth $1,000, but the big misses do matter. So, you know, one approach would be just to use like $1,000 for everything, but maybe we should tier it. But that's, you know, that's optional. That's just a minor choice you can make. Go to the next slide. So, you know, that's the cost part, which is how you want to improve the coverage times the value of that improved coverage. And then the other side of it is costs, which are the RUC costs, which are determined in RUC. And, you know, we don't have a, you know, this came up today in the discussion with Guillermo, is that we've also got the base RUC, you know, the amount of commitments that occurred because of under forecast, you know, under bidding and because of virtual supply. I have to keep it simple. I've just talked about the RUC cost as a single number. You know, if we wanted to get more complicated, we could, you know, prorate them and make some adjustments to reflect the amount of underbidding that's going on. So that would be, you know, additional complication, but the concept is just to use costs as measured by the program. Go to the next slide. So this is the overall metric, and we're looking at the larger of actual minus the difference between covered and clear. So that's the amount by which actual exceeded the free coverage. So that's our benefit. If actual is less than the free coverage, then there's no benefit. And then we're not going to have any negatives in here, so it's the larger of that or zero. And then, of course, if the actual is way bigger than our coverage and way bigger than cleared, there's no benefit because we didn't cover it. So it's also capped at the amount we cleared. So the benefit is either the amount of actual forecast error that we covered because of our mechanism, or the total amount that we cleared. And then the cost, of course, is the RUC cost. One of the things I like about this metric is that it has the property that if we do a really bad job of forecasting and it results in a lot of costs being incurred, this can be negative. So it tells you this is not good. And in this, in this sense, I think of this, it's a measure of the informativeness of the metric, because it's how much useful information does it provide. And it obviously, and in my view, it matters a lot more, having an excess requirement when in fact it's all unloaded capacity. Well, there's no cost to that. Who cares? Whereas it matters a lot if your error causes you to put on 4 launch start units that cost $1 million. So that's, how I think cost factors into how good a metric it is. Go to the next slide. So, this could be calculated directly for the method we're using or a method we've used in the past, just by pulling the data out of, the forecasts and the RUC solution. I walk through here in this and the next slide a few complications of when you're comparing it to another methodology that isn't being used in RUC. There's some things you weren't going to know. You weren't going to know, okay, well, how much savings, if it gets a slightly lower commitment of long start units, how much savings would that have been? Without rerunning RUC, you can't know exactly that. And if it requires to commit more, you can't know exactly how much more it would have cost without rerunning RUC. And I think, the way I propose to handle it is just take the average cost and use that. And on the next slide, go to the next slide, I say, you can do a sensitivity case that uses 1.5 times that average cost, or some other multiple you think is reasonable, to see if it matters. Maybe it does matter, maybe it doesn't matter. But if you're comparing between two metrics, as Ben was saying, if it always comes out one way, that's good. And if you can do a couple sensitivity cases like that, and if one always dominates, you can see it's a better method. So let me see if we want to go to the next slide yet, or if I should stop for questions. Okay, go on to slide 11. I'll go talk about this, then I'll stop for a bit. I think that one element of this is that it does take account of the economic efficiency of the RUC process. And you could say, well, that's not just the forecast. It isn't just the forecast. But if we're assessing, do we want to use this forecast to commit capacity in RUC and send ratepayers the bill, I think it's relevant. I think we have to say, if we apply this methodology to our existing RUC methodology, does it lead to a good outcome or a bad outcome? Now, that doesn't say that we shouldn't say, okay, if we get a bad outcome, we ought to look hard at RUC. And I think we ought to look hard at RUC in any case, but I think it is appropriate to say, when we're not just saying, is this a good or bad methodology in some abstract economic sense, we're saying, we're going to put it in place and we're going to send bills to ratepayers. So I think that we have to ask that question about, is this cost effective? And if you put in $1,000, a lot of things are going to be cost effective, because a 1 in 40 chance of $1,000 is $25, and that's more than the $1,340 that we were talking about. So, maybe it's worthwhile. Let me stop here and see if there are questions and comments, first from the MSC and then from other people, before I shift gears a little bit and talk about EBAM and so forth.
Thanks, Scott. It is important to be reminded that forecasts are valuable not just because they're accurate or have high, statistical quality, but if they wind up being used rationally in a rational decision process. And you've pointed out that if RUC has some flaws, then the best forecasts can't possibly correct that. So I like the idea of trying this. I don't have a sense of what it would be like to try to quantify this for different forecasting approaches, but I think that's well worth exploring. Jim?
Yeah, I was writing down in the beginning, like, okay, are we talking about the benefits of forecast or the benefits of RUC? And yeah, you addressed that at the end. It is an interesting sort of thought exercise. It's not just, you know, does a good forecast become less good? You could even, you know, define what is a good forecast as one that sort of deals with any underlying flaws in the market design in sort of the least damaging way or the most beneficial way or something like that. And this is trying to sort of channel that. And I got to say, I feel like this is a much more concrete concept than the H-score, which is kind of mashing together a lot of different things, but it's hard to know exactly, you know, what they mean in the end. And so if we do have to boil down performance to sort of a single indexer number, it does seem like something along these lines is kind of ultimately the relevant application. I do wonder, though, you know, to the extent that the Mosaic sort of family of approaches is being used for more than just RUC. You know, we have to kind of be cognizant of the fact that an approach like this, you know, might work well for RUC, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the forecast is good or bad for some other application as well, which I think is fine. But even kind of going through this process, I think is a worthy exercise. It is, I think, as you were getting at, you know, the problem with all these alternatives is is generating, particularly both the costs and the benefit numbers would be hypothetical, and so maybe there's ways to kind of do some projection of the kind of slope of the costs or slopes of the benefits there. But I do suspect where you were getting at is that there are going to be isolated forecast errors that are going to be much more damaging than others. And, you know, just kind of thinking about along a metric of this line, whether the performance is sort of highly influenced by a few outcomes versus kind of a steady chronic bias, I think would be very interesting to know as well. That's all I got for now.
Yep. I mean, I kind of think we can calculate the benefits because it's all based on hypothetical forecast errors times the value.
Yeah.
But it's the cost side where you start saying what would have been committed, where, you know, we got some approximations and we might find out that simple approximations tell us something, or we might find out, oh, they're all too close, that, you know, the approximation is everything. And I don't know.
Yeah.
And that's a good point about the other uses, Jim. But, you know, we might be able to take this same approach, and we've got the same thing in FMM about the forecast, the error, what we do, and then we might be able to look at, but it might be harder to pull out the separate commitment costs in RUC.
Yeah, I mean, the mechanics would be different, but I think the concept, you know, should be something that could be translated to every use case.
Yeah, I need to think about that, but I'll start with RUC and see if we can test it there and see what we learn.
That's
Are there any comments from the audience, the rapidly diminishing audience?
Tobias, did you want to jump in before we?
Yeah, I just said a quick thing I wanted to.
Both phone lines and audio lines are not, people aren't raising their hand.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Yolande.
So I wanted to bump a comment that Amber had in chat. This question of whether one replaces the other or if this is complementary. And I guess I want to put my 2 cents in there first, is that I see this very much as a complementary thing, in that the approach that I was talking about is purely just thinking about the bracket of how do we model and how good is the model. And then I think in complement, using this to interrogate these other questions of, do you need to use this when you have 20,000 load forecast as a peak, and these sorts of things. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So, Tobias, I think I agree with you that it's definitely complementary. So, for example, if you find out that one approach has a higher net benefits than another, your method with the various metrics can help us understand what is it about the methods and its results that are resulting in that. So, because that's, I mean, that's essential to know in order to try to improve the methods. So I agree that they're complementary.
They're not necessarily completely separable, though, in a sense that you might have a metric that kind of dominates by H-score, but still actually gives worse results, maybe because RUC is flawed, or maybe just because the H-score is focused on types of errors that are just not particularly consequential in the RUC world. And so, yeah, I think they're complementary in a way, but I think ultimately you kind of need to think both about it's kind of the value of the information that's being provided by the forecast is, I think what Scott's talking about here is sort of weighting it in a way that captures how that information is being used.
Right. I guess
so, like in your example of the, maybe forecast when load is 20,000 is, then I think some forecasts may be better or worse at low load. And I think what filtering it through this kind of metric is telling us is the forecasts that are actually worse during those conditions, if they're better during other conditions, that's sort of pointing towards a benefit of that latter sort of forecast.
So Jim, I think you're right. It's not just H, but it's rather understanding the components, being able to dig down in the texture and understand what is it about different methods are contributing it to being either helping you increase net benefits or not doing that. So I think we're saying the same thing. I don't see any other hands. Scott, you want to?
I'm going to go quickly because there are just a couple more slides, and go to slide 12. I thought given the future and that DAME is upon us and EDAM is upon us, I ought to move it away from just talking about in RUC, but very quickly thought through how would this work, and I convinced myself that I think this works in DAME and EDAM with a few changes. In DAME, we're going to be clearing imbalance reserves in the market, so we're not just going to be looking at uplift costs, so we're not going to have free capacity. Everything's going to get paid for. So we've just got to basically, the benefits function gets simpler. It's just what's the actual error and what was the amount of capacity we cleared, and then its value. And then we compare that to imbalance reserve costs, which are going to be a summation of quantities times prices. The part of that could get a little complicated is, ideally the perfect measure would be the amount procured to meet load forecast uncertainty at each location times the price at that location, which should take account of the impact of imbalance reserves and the nodal dispatch on displacing other energy. But it might be simpler, and maybe we'd find out that that's such a small number that all we do is add up the costs of what we pay the resources for providing it. But that's one choice, but it's not a big one. You could go either way if it were a big deal. But I think that this seems to me to be workable. And go to the next slide. The other part of the gist with the evolution of DAME into EDAM, we might care about this locationally. And again, it'd be more complicated because we've got target procurement, we've got load diversity, net uncertainty diversity, we've got transmission between regions, but I still think it would be workable to calculate this metric for each balancing area, or maybe for 3 regions, maybe calculate for the Northwest, the CAISO, and the Southwest, and the Rockies, because that'd sort of isolate a lot of the transmission congestion and say, is it working well in each of those areas? Not just is it working well for the CAISO, but is it working well for each of these regions that the benefits exceed the costs? So I just thought this is just looking way into the future, but I thought since that future is not that far away, it would worth putting in a couple slides to talk about this.
Okay.
I see Michelle's got a question or comment.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. And Michelle, thank you for sticking with us, by the way.
Operator, would you unmute Michelle?
Yolanda, can you?
Hey, yeah, this is Michelle. So I'm following this conversation, but I'm having just a little trouble. So I understand in the context of imbalance reserves what the cost would be. It would be the cost of the imbalance reserve. But I'm curious about how you would measure the benefits because, and I think I heard you say something about maybe putting it at $1,000, but it kind of matters in my mind because like we just thought about RUC and we just thought about the winter when load is 20,000, 20,000 megawatts, and it's pretty certain that, we can deal with the uncertainty. So the benefit might be close to zero. So how would you measure the benefit of getting a product you potentially didn't need? How would you ever do that?
Well, I think that would, for the benefit function, we're looking at the value of the uncovered actual net load uncertainty. So the amount of net load uncertainty that we need to cover by procuring imbalance reserves. Now, and we'd look at, did we need it given the actual? Now, I think maybe what you're getting at is the question I was raising also, that maybe not every megawatt of error counts the same. My thought is probably that it's not such a big deal for the operators if we miss our forecast by 50 megawatts or 100 megawatts. So that maybe we'd attach a relatively small value to those misses, but that when we're off by 1,000 megawatts, that's more of a problem. And we can do, so at least one tier of like small errors and big errors. And, we could think about that, and it probably wouldn't be that computationally more difficult to do it for 10 bands than 2 bands,
Okay, so imagine that we have a circumstance where we procured 4,000 megawatts of imbalance reserves. We know the cost of it, but we needed zero of it. Do we call that zero benefit because the uncertainty didn't arrive?
Right. That's that's the ruthless economics of this metric. If we don't need it, there's zero value. I'm comparing it to the actual.
Okay. So given that we're aiming for 97.5% coverage, we think 97.5% of the time we're not going to need it.
Right.
Okay. So then I would also just note that, this actually sort of combines with reliability capacity. So, imbalance reserves is going to be the uncertainty component. The reliability capacity is going to come in the RUC process after this, and that's going to be covering that additional amount. So, okay, I think I understand it now. Okay, thanks.
Great, glad.
Okay, Michelle, thank you. I'll check to see if there are any other comments, either from the committee or folks online. And if not, I've really enjoyed the meeting. As I hinted at the beginning, this meeting was particularly rich. I think had a high density of interesting ideas and data and discussion, and I definitely appreciate the contributions, Tobias, Amber, Guillermo, Scott, that you've all made. So makes me look forward to the next one even more. So at this point, Yolanda, I think we can end the call.
The conference is now over. You may now disconnect. Thank you for coming.